I am Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward smirking. "You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary in prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight as joined honor societies, and then everything changed. The clinking of silverware against fine china should have been a comforting sound. Instead, inside the mahogany-paneled dining room of my parents' Atlanta home, it sounded like the ticking of a bomb. "Pass the cranberry sauce, Valerie." "Oh, and try not to look so aggressive while you do it." That was Chelsea, my 32-year-old blonde, blue-eyed sister-in-law. She had been married to my older brother Trayvon for 3 years, which apparently gave her a VIP pass to critique my tone under the guise of being family. I slid the crystal bowl across the table, my face an unreadable mask. "I am not aggressive, Chelsea. I am just chewing my food." "She is just stressed, baby," Trayvon chimed in, flashing that $1 million smile that had been getting him out of trouble since he was 5. He adjusted his Rolex, a watch I knew for a fact he bought using a credit card under my father's name. Renting a one-bedroom apartment in this economy is tough for single women. "Right, Valerie. I mean, inspecting commercial buildings all day must be so draining." "I am a commercial real estate portfolio manager, Trayvon." I corrected him, keeping my voice dangerously low. "I do not inspect buildings. I evaluate multi-million-dollar portfolios and assess financial risks to prevent banks from lending money to frauds. Like the firm that rejected your business loan last month." The entire table went dead silent. The smell of roasted turkey and collard greens suddenly felt suffocating. Chelsea gasped, clutching her pearls literally. "Valerie." That was completely uncalled for. Trayvon is an entrepreneur. His crypto investment firm is just going through a transitional phase. "You really need to work on your bitterness." Bitterness, I let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Chelsea, your husband's transitional phase cost my parents $20,000 last year alone. But please tell me more about my bitterness. Also, that designer bag you brought in tonight. It is from a previous season, and I happen to know it was bought on a high-interest credit card because I saw the statement. Your luxury lifestyle is a house of cards." Chelsea's face turned a mottled shade of red, and her eyes welled up with performative tears. She looked around the table, playing the victim perfectly. "I cannot believe you are speaking to me this way in your family's home. I have tried so hard to be welcoming, to understand your culture, and you just bully me." "That is enough." Vivian's voice cracked like a whip. My mother, 60 years old, dressed in her signature crimson dress, her hair perfectly pressed, slammed her wine glass onto the table. Her eyes, dark and furious, locked onto me. "You will not disrespect your sister-in-law in my house, Valerie. You are always trying to bully her because she is different. It is embarrassing. You are bitter because you are 32, single, and sitting alone in a rented apartment. Trayvon is out there building a legacy. He is the man of this house. He has a wife. He is making moves. You are just a burden, always have been." The word hung in the air. Burden. I looked at my father, Desmond. He was staring intensely at his mashed potatoes, refusing to make eye contact. He was 62, a man who loved quoting Bible verses about family unity, but never had the spine to defend his daughter. "Dad," I said softly, Are you going to let her call me a burden? Desmond shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Now, Valerie, your mother is just stressed. You know how hard Trayvon works. You should not have brought up his finances. Apologize to your brother and Chelsea and let us enjoy the meal. I stared at the three of them, Vivian, radiating self-righteous anger, Desmond shrinking into his chair, and Trayvon smirking behind his wine glass, the undisputed golden child of the family. A burden. They called me a burden. The daughter who had her college tuition stripped away at 19 because Trayvon needed seed money for a nightclub that failed in 6 months. The daughter who waited tables for 4 years to pay her own way through university. The daughter who for the last 3 years had been quietly transferring $3,000 a month into Desmond's bank account because he claimed his pension was not clearing right. I did not scream. I did not cry. Black women are taught that our tears are a sign of weakness, and our anger is a weapon used against us. So I gave them neither. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it next to my plate. You are right, I said, my voice eerily calm. I am a burden, and it is time I stop weighing this family down. I stood up, pushing my chair back. Oh, stop the theatrics, Valerie. Vivian rolled her eyes, cutting a piece of turkey. Sit down and finish your food. Nobody has time for your tantrums today. The pastor is coming over for dessert, and I expect you to smile. Enjoy the pie, I said, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. And Trayvon, make sure you check your tire pressure. It is getting cold out. I walked out of the dining room without looking back. As I reached the front door, I could hear Chelsea's high-pitched voice whining. She is so exhausting. I do not know how you guys deal with her negative aura. I stepped out into the crisp November air. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, severing the last tie of familial guilt I had been carrying for over a decade. I walked to my car, pulled out my phone, and opened my banking app. It took exactly 3 taps. Recurring transfer $3,000 to Desmond's checking account. Action cancel. Confirm yes. I watched the screen as the status changed to canceled. I did not stop there. I went into my family phone plan and removed Trayvon and Chelsea's numbers. I logged into the shared Amazon Prime account and changed the password. Every single invisible thread I had used to prop up their luxurious fake lifestyle was severed in less than 5 minutes. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Aunt Loretta, my mother's estranged sister. Did you leave the dinner already? I saw Vivian posting a family picture without you. I typed back quickly. I am done, Auntie. I cut the cord. It is about damn time, baby girl. Call me tomorrow. I have something you need to hear. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and drove away from the upscale neighborhood. I did not know what Aunt Loretta wanted to tell me, but my mind was already shifting gears. I was a commercial portfolio manager. I analyzed data, tracked money, and exposed frauds for a living. For too long, I had ignored the red flags in my own family. They thought I was just a bitter single black woman who would eventually come crawling back for their conditional love. They had no idea that they had just unleashed a predator. 3 weeks later, the consequences of my exit would crash down on them, and it would start with a single panicked phone call from a man who realized his golden child could not save him. The vibration of my phone broke the quiet hum of my office. It was an unknown number, but the area code was unmistakably Atlanta. 3 weeks had passed since the Thanksgiving dinner where my mother declared me a burden. 3 weeks of absolute silence after I canceled the monthly $3,000 transfer that had been quietly keeping their heads above water. I stared at the blinking screen for a long moment before pressing accept. I did not say hello. I just waited. Heavy breathing came through the receiver, followed by a nervous clearing of the throat. It was my father. He sounded small, stripped of the booming authority he usually reserved for quoting scripture at me. Valerie, please do not hang up, Desmond said. His voice was a harsh whisper, as if he was hiding in a closet. I had to use a prepaid phone because my calls to you were not going through. I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair and looked out at the city skyline from my corner office. You are blocked, Dad. I told you I was done being the family burden. What do you want? He sighed a long, drawn-out sound meant to elicit guilt. You know the Bible says to honor thy father and mother, so your days may be long. We are family, Valerie. You cannot just abandon us over a little disagreement at the dinner table. Your mother is sick with worry. I doubt Vivian is worried about anything other than her image at the country club, I replied smoothly. Cut the sermon, Dad. Why are you calling me from a burner phone? The silence stretched so thin it almost snapped. Finally, his voice cracked. We got a notice from the bank today. A pre-foreclosure warning. The mortgage payment bounced. It seems there was an issue with your account. There was no issue with my account, I corrected him. I canceled the recurring transfer. I told Trevin to step up and handle things since he is the man of the house and the pride of the family. Why do you not ask the crypto king for the money? Desmond sounded desperate now. You know your brother's funds are tied up in transitional assets right now. He is closing a massive deal next month. We just need you to cover the $6,000 for December and January so we do not lose the house. I stopped breathing. The expensive pen in my hand slipped and clattered onto the glass desk. I sat straight up. $6,000, I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Dad, the mortgage on that house has been $1,500 a month for the last 10 years. I was sending you $3,000 to cover the mortgage, the utilities, and Vivian's car note. Why is the bank asking for $6,000? I could hear him stammering, the sudden panic in his breath. He realized his mistake instantly. It is just property taxes went up and insurance, you know how inflation is. Do not lie to me, I snapped. Property taxes do not quadruple a mortgage payment. What did you do? Desmond mumbled something unintelligible. Then the line went dead. He hung up on me. I slowly lowered the phone. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was already shifting into a cold, calculated gear. I am a commercial real estate portfolio manager. I track distressed assets and expose financial fraud for living. My parents had just handed me a puzzle, and they forgot I held all the keys. I turned to my computer and logged into my firm's proprietary real estate database. It gives me access to every deed, lien, and public financial record in the country. I typed in my parents' address. The search results loaded in less than 2 seconds. I clicked on the lien history, and what I saw made my blood run absolutely cold. 18 months ago, a second mortgage had been taken out on the property. My parents had borrowed $250,000 against the equity of the home they had spent 30 years paying off. I scrolled down to see the disbursement records. The loan was not sitting in a savings account. It had been wired in a lump sum to an entity called Apex Digital Ventures. I opened a new tab and ran a search on that company name. The registered agent and sole proprietor was Trevon. I sat in the quiet of my office staring at the glowing screen. The betrayal was so profound it felt physical. For 3 years I had been paying the black tax. I skipped vacations, drove a sensible sedan, and lived in a rented apartment so I could send them $3,000 a month because they claimed Desmond's pension was failing. All the while they had mortgaged the family home to give Trayvon $250,000 to fund his fake luxury lifestyle. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Aunt Loretta. We had arranged to meet for coffee later that afternoon, but she was texting me instead. Check Chelsea's social media right now, the message read. I opened the app and searched for my sister-in-law's profile. Her latest post was a video uploaded just an hour ago. Chelsea was jumping up and down in a designer tracksuit in front of my parents' house. Sitting in the driveway was a brand new Mercedes SUV with a giant red bow on the hood. The caption read, "Hubby surprised me for our anniversary, so blessed to be married to a self-made entrepreneur. Hard work pays off." I stared at the pristine white luxury vehicle. It was paid for with the equity of my parents' home. The same home that was now entering foreclosure because Trevon was bleeding them dry. My parents had literally sacrificed their shelter to buy a white woman a luxury car while looking me in the face and calling me a burden. I closed the app. I did not cry. The sadness had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp focus. I went back to the financial database and looked closer at the institution holding my parents' second mortgage. It was a secondary lender known for bundling high-risk loans and selling them off to corporate investment firms. I checked the current portfolio holder. A grim smile spread across my face. The bundle of bad debt containing my parents' house had just been acquired by my firm. It was sitting in a distressed asset pool waiting to be liquidated. I picked up my phone and dialed my private wealth attorney. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Robert, I need you to draft incorporation papers immediately," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional. "I want to form an anonymous limited liability company in Delaware. Name it Phoenix Holdings. I need it completely insulated and untraceable to my name." "What is the rush?" Robert asked, his typing echoing through the receiver. "I am going to buy a distressed debt portfolio from my own firm," I explained. "There is a specific property facing foreclosure, and I want to be the sole owner of the debt by the end of the week." Robert agreed and promised the paperwork by morning. I hung up the phone and looked back out at the city. My family thought they had successfully used me. They thought Vivian could insult me at the dinner table while secretly using my hard-earned money to keep the lights on. They thought Trayvon could parade around as a wealthy investor while destroying his parents' future. But they had miscalculated terribly. They thought they were dealing with an obedient, guilt-ridden daughter. They did not know they were dealing with the person who was about to become their landlord. 3 weeks passed since I walked out of that dining room. 21 days of absolute silence. It was the most peaceful period of my adult life. For years, my mornings had started with anxious text messages from my mother about unexpected bills or subtle guilt trips from my father about the rising cost of living. Now my phone was quiet. I threw myself into my work at the commercial real estate firm. I managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, assessing risk and restructuring debt for commercial properties across the eastern seaboard. My colleagues saw a sharp, focused professional. They had no idea I was the designated scapegoat of a family that valued appearance over everything else. I had successfully severed the financial cord, and for the first time in my life, I was keeping my own money. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a complex commercial lease agreement when my phone vibrated against the polished wood. The screen displayed an unknown local number. I usually let unknown numbers go to voicemail, but something made me answer. I picked up the phone and said hello. There was a heavy pause on the other end, followed by a nervous clearing of a throat. It was Desmond. My father. "Valerie, please do not hang up," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "I had to buy a prepaid phone at the gas station because my calls to your cell phone are not going through." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. "You are blocked, Dad," I told him calmly. "I told you I was done being the family burden. I am not sending any more money, so there is no reason for us to speak." He let out a long, trembling sigh that was designed to make me feel guilty. He always used guilt as his primary weapon. "Valerie, the Bible says to honor thy father and mother, so your days may be long upon the earth. You cannot just abandon your family over a silly disagreement at the Thanksgiving table. Your mother is sick with worry, and we are in serious trouble." I sincerely doubt Vivian is worried about anything other than her image at the church and her sorority meetings, I replied. "Cut the sermon, Dad. Why are you calling me from a burner phone while hiding from your wife?" The silence stretched out for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with genuine panic. "We got a certified letter from the bank today, Valerie. It is a pre-foreclosure warning. The mortgage payment bounced and we are officially in default. They are threatening to take the house." I felt a brief flash of surprise, but I kept my voice perfectly level. "That sounds like a problem for the man of the house," I said. "You and Mom made it very clear that Trayvon is the pride of this family. He is the successful entrepreneur building a legacy. Why do you not ask your golden boy to pay the mortgage?" Desmond sounded frantic now. "You know your brother has his funds tied up in transitional digital assets right now. He is closing a massive cryptocurrency deal next month that will set us all up for life. We just need you to cover the $6,000 for this month so the bank does not initiate the foreclosure process. Please, Valerie, we just need $6,000. I stopped breathing. The expensive pen I was holding slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the glass surface of my desk. I sat straight up, my mind racing as the numbers collided in my head. $6,000, I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Dad, the mortgage on that house has been $1,500 a month for the last 10 years. I was sending you $3,000 every single month to cover the mortgage, the utilities, and Vivian car note. Why is the bank suddenly asking for $6,000 just to cover the minimum monthly payment? I could hear him stammering on the other end of the line. I could hear the sudden panic in his shallow breaths. He realized his mistake the moment the words left his mouth. It is just that property taxes went up, he mumbled quickly. And insurance premiums are higher now. You know how inflation is affecting everything, Valerie. Please just send the money. Do not lie to me, I snapped. Property taxes do not quadruple a mortgage payment overnight. What did you do to that house? Desmond muttered something completely unintelligible about trusting family and having faith before the line went completely dead. He hung up on me. I slowly lowered the phone to my desk. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was incredibly clear. My parents had just handed me a massive puzzle, and they had forgotten that I held all the keys to solve it. They saw me as a bitter, single woman with a boring desk job. They did not understand the power I wielded in the real estate sector. I turned back to my dual monitors and logged into my firm proprietary commercial real estate database. This system gave me access to every deed, every lien, and every public financial record attached to any property in the country. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I typed in the exact address of my childhood home in Atlanta. The search results loaded in a fraction of a second. I bypassed the basic property details and went straight to the lien history. What I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. The original mortgage, the one they had been paying down for 30 years, was almost cleared. But 18 months ago, a massive second mortgage had been taken out against the property. My parents had borrowed $250,000 against the equity of the home. They had essentially remortgaged their entire life with a high-interest secondary lender known for predatory lending practices. I stared at the glowing screen tracking the financial records. A second mortgage of that size meant a massive monthly payment. That explained the $6,000 Desmond was begging for. For 3 years, I had been paying the black tax, sacrificing my own savings, and living below my means to send them money because they claimed they were struggling on a fixed income. All the while, they had pulled $250,000 out of their home equity. I started digging deeper into the public disbursement records. The loan was not sitting in a secure savings account, and it was not used for home renovations. The funds had been wired in a lump sum to an external corporate entity. I copied the name of the entity and ran a separate search through our corporate registry database. The company was called Apex Digital Ventures. The registered agent and sole proprietor listed on the corporate filings was Trayvon. I sat back in my chair, completely stunned by the magnitude of the deception. My parents had literally mortgaged the roof over their heads to give Trayvon $250,000 to fund his fake luxury lifestyle. They had risked their home to finance his fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme while looking me in the face and calling me a burden. They used my monthly financial support to keep themselves afloat while Trayvon drained their equity dry. The rage that washed over me was cold and absolute. I did not shed a single tear. I picked up my phone to check my messages and saw a text from Aunt Loretta. She was the only person in the family who saw through Vivian's toxic facade. Her text simply said that Vivian was at church right now, telling the entire congregation that I had suffered a mental breakdown and got fired from my job. She was destroying my reputation to explain why I was no longer coming around to family events. A second message from Aunt Loretta popped up immediately after. It told me to check Chelsea's social media page right now. I opened the application and searched for my sister-in-law. Her latest post was a video uploaded just an hour ago. Chelsea was jumping up and down in a designer tracksuit in front of my parents' house. Sitting in the driveway was a brand new Mercedes SUV with a giant red bow on the hood. The caption praised her self-made entrepreneur husband for the amazing anniversary surprise. I stared at the pristine white luxury vehicle. It was paid for with the equity of my parents' home. The same home that was now entering foreclosure because Trayvon was bleeding them dry. My parents had literally sacrificed their shelter to buy a white woman a luxury car while looking me in the face and calling me a burden. The pieces of the puzzle locked into place perfectly. I looked back at the database screen showing the distressed second mortgage. The red flags were glaring and the path forward was suddenly crystal clear. The morning sun barely cut through my office window, but my screen glared with undeniable proof of my family financial sins. I sat staring at the digital scans of the closing documents for the second mortgage. As a commercial real estate portfolio manager, I knew exactly what to look for in predatory lending paperwork. My parents' house had 30 years of equity paid off until 18 months ago. I pulled up the signature page of the loan agreement and zoomed in. There were two signatures required: Desmond and Vivian. I knew my mother handwriting intimately. Vivian wrote with sharp, aggressive angles. The signature on this $250,000 loan was shaky and rounded. It was a clumsy, obvious forgery. Desmond had forged his own wife's signature to bypass her knowing about the loan. My father had secretly risked his wife's shelter to protect his son. He had funneled $250,000 of stolen equity directly into Apex Digital Ventures, which was Trayvon's fake cryptocurrency firm. It all made sickening sense now. Desmond was hiding the foreclosure notices from Vivian. He needed my $3,000 a month, not for a failing pension, but to desperately cover massive interest payments on a fraudulent loan he took out for Trayvon. And when I cut the cord, the entire house of cards collapsed. My desk phone buzzed. It was time to meet Aunt Loretta. I took the elevator down to the street level, walking to a quiet coffee shop we frequented. Loretta was already there, sitting in a corner booth with two black coffees. She was the only person who refused to participate in Vivian toxic image crafting. "You found something bad," she said quietly. I sat down and told her everything. I told her about the forged second mortgage, the fake crypto company, and the fact that Desmond was begging me for $6,000 to stop an imminent foreclosure. Loretta let out a bitter laugh. "Well, that explains the performance your mother gave yesterday morning," she said. She took a sip of her coffee and told me about the Sunday service. Vivian had marched right up to the pulpit during the testimony portion of the service. In front of the entire congregation, the pastor and all of her judgmental sorority sisters, Vivian, put on a masterclass in manipulation. She cried heavy, performative tears and asked the church to pray for my soul. She told everyone that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown, that I had been fired from my corporate job, and that I was spiraling out of control. Vivian claimed my sudden financial ruin was the reason I had selfishly abandoned the family at Thanksgiving. She made herself the victim of a tragic, ungrateful child. Loretta reached into her purse and pulled out her smartphone. "You need to see what your sister-in-law is doing right now," Loretta said, sliding the phone to me. The screen was open to Chelsea's social media page. It was a live video posted just hours ago. Chelsea was wearing a brand new designer outfit standing in the driveway of my parents' house. The camera panned to show a pristine white luxury vehicle parked right in front of the garage. Chelsea was squealing with delight, talking about how her amazing self-made entrepreneur husband had just surprised her with her dream car. The caption read, "Hard work always pays off, so blessed to have a provider." I stared at the video, watching Chelsea flaunt a vehicle that cost more than most people's annual salary. I mentally cross-referenced the timeline. The down payment for that luxury car perfectly matched the exact dollar amount of the missed mortgage payment that had triggered the pre-foreclosure warning. Trayvon had literally taken the money Desmond scrambled to find to save the house and used it to buy his white wife a luxury car just to keep up appearances online. My parents were losing their home, and Chelsea was posting about it, calling it hard work. I handed the phone back to Loretta without a word. I thanked her for the coffee and walked back to my office building. I did not feel anger anymore. Anger was an emotional response, and emotions made people sloppy. Trayvon and Desmond were sloppy. Vivian was sloppy. I was going to be precise. I rode the elevator back to the top floor and marched straight to my desk. I opened the commercial real estate database one more time. I needed to know exactly who held the paper on my parents' second mortgage. I pulled the chain of title and tracked the debt assignment. The secondary lender that originally issued the forged loan had gone bankrupt 6 months ago. Their entire portfolio of toxic high-risk debt had been bundled and sold off at a massive discount to a larger corporate entity. I traced the routing numbers and the corporate acquisition filings. When the final screen loaded, I actually let out a genuine laugh. The bundle of bad debt containing the mortgage to my parents' house had been acquired by my own investment firm. It was sitting in a distressed asset pool, right here in my department, waiting to be evaluated and liquidated. I literally managed the department that controlled the fate of their home. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my private wealth attorney. Robert answered on the second ring, sounding surprised. I bypassed the small talk and gave him explicit instructions. I told him I needed to form an anonymous limited liability company in Delaware immediately. I wanted it completely insulated and shielded behind corporate privacy laws. Name the entity Phoenix Holdings, I told him, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. I told him I needed the incorporation documents expedited and finalized by the end of the day. Robert asked me what the rush was, noting the urgency in my instructions. I explained that my firm was about to liquidate a specific package of distressed residential debt and Phoenix Holdings was going to purchase one particular mortgage out of that pool. I was going to buy the debt on my parents' house. By the end of the week, I would legally own the paper on their home. They thought they were dealing with a broken scapegoat who would eventually cave to church gossip and parental guilt. They had no idea they were dealing with the exact person who was about to execute their foreclosure. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp chill in the air. I drove my modest sedan to the sprawling mega church my parents attended in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta. I rarely went to their church, finding the atmosphere more akin to a country club than a place of worship, but Aunt Loretta had insisted I meet her there. We walked into the grand sanctuary together, taking seats near the back. The choir sang, the pastor delivered a booming sermon about forgiveness and family unity, and all the while I sat quietly feeling the heavy, certified document resting inside my leather tote bag. When the service concluded, the congregation spilled out into the massive fellowship hall. The room smelled of roasted coffee and expensive floral perfumes. I spotted my mother immediately. Vivian was holding court near the refreshment table, surrounded by her sorority sisters. She wore a tailored crimson suit and a wide-brimmed hat, playing the role of the pious matriarch to perfection. Trevon stood a few feet away, wearing a custom-tailored suit and adjusting his Rolex, looking bored and arrogant. It did not take long for Vivian to spot me. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before a brilliant, calculated idea washed over her face. She saw an opportunity for the ultimate performance. Vivian strode across the fellowship hall, deliberately drawing the attention of her sorority sisters and Pastor Williams. They followed her like a flock of well-dressed vultures, eager for drama. As she approached me, Vivian let out a loud, theatrical sob. She placed a manicured hand over her heart and let perfect performative tears well up in her eyes. Valerie, Vivian cried out, her voice echoing loudly enough to stop the conversations around us. Please, baby, you have to stop this terrible tantrum. We love you so much, but your mental health is destroying this family. We are begging you to come home and get the psychiatric help you need. Pastor Williams stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Vivian's shoulder. He looked at me with deep pastoral disappointment, his brow furrowed with concern. Valerie, your mother has been weeping in my office for days, he said softly. We have the entire prayer chain interceding for your restoration. She told me you suffered a severe mental breakdown at work and that you have abandoned your family in their darkest hour of financial need. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against the absurd accusations. I simply reached into my tote bag and pulled out the crisp folded document I had printed from my firm commercial real estate database. I did not hand it to Vivian. I bypassed her completely and held the paper out to Pastor Williams. Pastor, since my mother is asking for the church prayers regarding our family, Sudden financial ruin, I said, keeping my tone dead flat and entirely devoid of emotion. I believe the congregation deserves the absolute truth. Pastor Williams took the paper, slowly unfolding it with a confused expression. Vivian frowned, her performative tears instantly drying up as a flash of genuine panic crossed her features. That is not a medical bill from a psychiatric ward. I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet hall. That is a certified pre-foreclosure warning from a secondary lender, complete with the property lien history. My parents' house is not in jeopardy because I stopped my monthly charity payments. The house is in foreclosure because my father forged my mother's signature on a $250,000 second mortgage, and he funneled every single cent of that stolen equity directly into Trayvon fake cryptocurrency company. The silence that fell over the fellowship hall was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the carpeted floor. Pastor Williams stared at the document, his eyes widening as he read the disbursement records I had explicitly highlighted in yellow ink. Vivian snatched the paper from his hands, her eyes scanning the page frantically. As she read the details of the forged signature and the massive loan, the blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and gray. She turned slowly to look at Trayvon, who suddenly resembled a cornered animal. The sorority sisters began to whisper furiously behind their hands. Vivian's perfectly crafted image of upper-middle-class superiority shattered into a million pieces right there in the church. Trayvon stepped forward, his face mottled red with humiliation and fury. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You are just a bitter, jealous failure," Trayvon hissed, trying to physically intimidate me by stepping into my personal space. Apex Digital Ventures is a completely legitimate enterprise. I have a massive deal closing this week with a major institutional investor. When that money hits my account, you are going to look like a broke, pathetic fool. Keep your precious $3,000, Valerie. I do not need your pennies. He grabbed Vivian by the arm and dragged her toward the exit, pushing past the staring church members. I watched them leave, took a calm sip of my coffee, and smiled politely at the stunned pastor before walking out to my car with Aunt Loretta. Tuesday morning arrived with a steady rain washing over the city. I was sitting in my sleek, glass-walled corner office on the 40th floor of my firm headquarters. The paperwork for Phoenix Holdings was complete, and the legal transfer of my parents' distressed debt portfolio was officially in motion. My desk phone chimed, breaking my concentration. My receptionist sounded confused as she informed me that a woman named Chelsea was in the lobby, demanding to see me without an appointment. I smiled grimly and told her to send my sister-in-law up. A few minutes later, Chelsea pushed through my heavy office door. She was wearing her usual flashy designer labels, clutching the expensive handbag she had bought on credit. But the moment she stepped inside, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened as she took in the panoramic city views, the expensive modern art hanging on the walls, and the massive mahogany desk I sat behind. She looked at the bustling trading floor visible through my glass walls. This reality did not fit the narrative she had been fed about the bitter, broke woman living in a cheap rental apartment. Chelsea recovered her composure quickly, shifting immediately into her default setting of entitlement, masked by victimhood. She marched up to my desk and crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "I am only here because Trayvon is too proud to ask for your help after what you did at church," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We need a bridge loan." I leaned back in my chair and discreetly tapped the record button on my desk phone, ensuring every word of this conversation would be captured. "A bridge loan," I repeated softly. "A bridge loan for what exactly?" "Chelsea, to pay the insurance on the brand new Mercedes sitting in your driveway." Her face flushed an angry shade of crimson. She immediately started crying, deploying her weaponized white tears as if on command. "You are so aggressive and mean," she sobbed, dabbing at her dry eyes. "You have absolutely no family values. Trayvon is out there working 24 hours a day, trying to build generational wealth for this family, and you are just sitting up here in your ivory tower judging us. He just needs a tiny loan to cover his operating expenses until his investor payout clears on Friday." I stared at her performative weeping with absolute disgust. No legitimate institutional investor is touching Trayvon fake crypto portfolio, I told her coldly. His company is a shell. It is a financial black hole that swallowed your in-laws' home equity. You are living in a fantasy world. Chelsea stopped crying instantly. Her eyes narrowed and the victim routine vanished, replaced by sheer arrogance. That shows exactly how little you know about high-level business, she snapped, leaning over my desk and glaring at me. Trayvon is a brilliant visionary. Sterling Global Capital is wiring him $500,000 this Friday. So keep your pathetic money, you bitter witch. We are going to be richer than you could ever imagine. She spun on her designer heels and stormed out of my office, slamming the heavy glass door behind her so hard the panes rattled. I sat frozen in my chair long after she left. The name she had just dropped echoed loudly in my mind. Sterling Global Capital. I did not need to run a background search on that company. I already knew exactly who they were. My firm risk assessment department had blacklisted them 6 months ago. Sterling Global Capital was not a venture capital firm. It was a notorious shell corporation currently under active federal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for operating a massive offshore Ponzi scheme. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Trayvon was not just a terrible businessman who had foolishly lost his parents' retirement money. He was actively funneling funds for a criminal syndicate. He was acting as a money mule, laundering illicit cash through his fake crypto business, and he was about to receive $500,000 of dirty money directly into his personal accounts. He wasn't just failing at business, he was stealing on a federal level, and he was about to bring the entire weight of the United States government right to my parents' doorstep. I reached for my phone knowing my next call would change the trajectory of our family forever. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division in Atlanta. As a portfolio manager dealing with distressed commercial assets, I occasionally worked with federal regulators on corporate fraud cases. I had a direct contact there named Agent Harris. I told him everything I knew about Sterling Global Capital and Apex Digital Ventures. I explained that my brother was the registered agent for Apex and that a wire transfer of $500,000 was scheduled for Friday. Harris was very interested in this information. He told me Sterling Global had a known pattern of using arrogant, desperate individuals as money mules. Trayvon was the absolute perfect target. He was greedy, blinded by his own ego, and completely ignorant of real financial regulations. Harris told me the federal agents would freeze the accounts the exact moment the wire hit the bank. Trayvon would not get a single penny of that money. Instead, he was going to get a visit from federal agents. I thanked Harris and hung up the phone. My next call was to Robert, my private wealth attorney. I needed to know the exact status of Phoenix Holdings and the acquisition of the secondary mortgage. Robert confirmed that all the paperwork was finalized and the funds had cleared. The distressed debt portfolio had been successfully transferred from my firm. Phoenix Holdings was now the sole legal owner of the second mortgage on my parents' house. Since they were already officially in default, I had the legal right to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. I instructed Robert to draft the final notice of default and the formal notice to vacate. I wanted the papers served by hand on Friday afternoon, right around the time Trayvon realized his bank accounts were frozen by the federal government. The next 3 days passed with a strange, beautiful sense of calm. I went to work, I drank my morning coffee, and I watched the trap I had meticulously set slowly close around my toxic family. They had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence and overestimating their own importance. Now, they were about to learn a devastating lesson in commercial finance and federal law. Friday afternoon finally arrived. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a new property acquisition when my personal phone began to buzz incessantly. Aunt Loretta was texting me rapid-fire updates. She said a fleet of black SUVs had just swarmed my parents' quiet suburban street. Federal agents wearing windbreakers had marched right up the driveway and kicked the front door open. They were executing a massive search warrant and seizing all of Trayvon's computers, external hard drives, and paper files. Chelsea's brand new luxury SUV was currently being loaded onto a flatbed tow truck right in front of all the nosy neighbors because it was purchased with illicit laundered funds. Loretta sent me a link to a live video stream from a neighbor across the street. I watched the chaos unfold on my computer screen. Vivian was standing on the pristine front lawn, screaming at the federal agents in her expensive silk robe. She was flailing her arms and demanding they respect her social status. Desmond was sitting on the curb with his head in his hands, looking absolutely defeated and broken. Trayvon was being led out of the house in handcuffs while an agent read him his rights. His grand cryptocurrency empire was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on federal fraud and stolen home equity. He was crying, begging the agents to let him call his investors. He looked nothing like the proud man of the house my parents always claimed he was. But the real devastating blow had not even landed yet. As the federal agents were finishing their raid and loading Trayvon into the back of a government vehicle, a sleek black town car pulled up to the edge of the driveway. A process server stepped out holding a thick manila envelope. He walked right past the federal agents, right past the weeping Vivian, and handed the envelope directly to Desmond. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope. It was the official notice of foreclosure and eviction from Phoenix Holdings. My parents had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises and hand over the keys. They had lost absolutely everything in the span of a single afternoon. Their stolen money, their country club reputation, and their beloved colonial home were all gone. My office phone rang. It was Desmond calling from his prepaid burner phone. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone so I could keep my hands free. Valerie, his voice was trembling uncontrollably. Everything is gone. The feds took Trayvon. They took Chelsea car, and the bank just served us with foreclosure papers. They sold our mortgage to some holding company called Phoenix Holdings. We are going to be homeless, Valerie. You have to help us. You have to call your firm and see if they can stop this foreclosure. I leaned closer to the phone. My voice was as cold and sharp as cracked ice. Dad, I cannot stop Phoenix Holdings from foreclosing on your house. Why not? Desmond pleaded, his voice cracking with pure desperation. You are a powerful portfolio manager. You evaluate corporate portfolios all day. You can talk to whoever runs Phoenix Holdings and make them understand that we are a good Christian family facing a temporary hardship. I let a long, heavy silence stretch over the line, letting his pathetic desperation hang in the air. Then I finally spoke. I cannot talk to them, Dad, because I am them. I own Phoenix Holdings. I bought your distressed debt from my firm 3 days ago. The absolute silence on the other end of the line was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my 32 years of life. I could hear Desmond's shallow, panicked breathing as my words slowly registered in his mind. What he finally whispered. What are you saying, Valerie? I am saying that you mortgaged the family home to fund Trayvon's fraudulent lifestyle. You lied to me for 3 years, taking my money while looking me in the face and calling me a burden. You let Vivian humiliate me in front of the entire church and her sorority sisters. So I bought your bad debt. I am your landlord now, and you are officially 30 days late on your rent. Vivian must have grabbed the phone from his hands because suddenly her shrill voice was screaming through the speaker. You wicked, ungrateful child! You cannot do this to your own mother. We gave you life. We raised you. You are going to give us this house back right now, or I will curse the day you were born. Your curses do not work on me anymore, Vivian, I replied smoothly. The bank took your house because you failed to pay your bills. I just happened to be the one who bought it at a steep discount. You have exactly 30 days to pack your designer bags and get off my property. Maybe Trayvon can let you sleep on the floor of his federal jail cell. I reached out and hung up the phone, severing the connection forever. I blocked the burner number and walked over to my office window. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glass buildings of the Atlanta skyline. For my entire life, I had let them make me feel small. I had let them dictate my worth, drain my financial resources, and treat me like a second-class citizen in my own family. But I was not the quiet, obedient scapegoat anymore. I was the architect of my own life, and I had just successfully evicted the toxicity from my world. I smiled, picked up my expensive pen, and went back to work. The following Sunday, I drove my car to the massive suburban megachurch my parents had attended for years. Aunt Loretta had warned me that Vivian was planning a spectacle, and I knew I had to be ready. The church was a sprawling complex with giant stained glass windows and perfectly manicured lawns. I parked and walked inside the grand sanctuary, taking a seat near the very back. I wore a tailored dark suit, keeping my posture perfectly straight. The choir finished their final song, and the service concluded with a booming prayer. The enormous congregation began to slowly file out into the opulent fellowship hall. The space was filled with the smell of expensive coffee and catered pastries. People were gathered in tight social circles wearing their finest designer suits and Sunday dresses. I stood near a marble pillar holding my designer leather tote bag tightly against my side. It did not take long for the ambush to unfold exactly as I expected. Vivian spotted me from across the room. She was holding court with her elite circle of sorority sisters and Pastor Williams. She wore a bright matching skirt suit and an elaborate hat. The moment she saw me, a calculated glint flashed in her eyes. She nudged Trayvon, who was standing beside her in a flashy suit, and they marched directly toward me. The pastor and the sorority sisters followed close behind, drawn by the magnetic pull of incoming drama. As soon as they were close enough for an audience, Vivian threw her hands up and let out a loud theatrical wail. She collapsed forward slightly, clutching her chest as perfect tears streamed down her perfectly powdered cheeks. "Valerie," she cried out, her voice echoing over the quiet chatter of the fellowship hall. "Please, baby. You have to stop this tantrum. Your mental health is tearing our family apart. We love you so much and we are begging you to come home and get the psychiatric help you need. You cannot keep running away from us." Pastor Williams stepped forward wearing a look of deep pastoral sorrow. He placed a comforting hand on Vivian's shoulder and looked at me with severe disappointment. "Valerie, your mother has been weeping in my office all week," he said in a hushed but carrying tone. "She told us you suffered a severe breakdown at work and lost your corporate job. Family must stand united during financial ruin. You cannot abandon them when they are struggling so deeply." I did not break character for a single second. I did not raise my voice or show any anger. The sorority sisters were leaning in, whispering behind their manicured hands, waiting for me to explode. Instead, I reached slowly into my tote bag and pulled out a crisp, thick document. It was the certified foreclosure warning letter I had printed directly from my firm commercial real estate database. I did not hand the paper to Vivian. I bypassed my mother completely and held it out to the pastor. "Pastor Williams," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade. "Since my mother is asking for the church to pray for our family financial ruin, I think the congregation deserves the absolute truth. My mother is not crying because I am having a mental breakdown. She is crying because her house is in active foreclosure. I have not lost my job. My father secretly forged my mother's signature on a second mortgage and funneled $250,000 of their home equity directly to my brother. Trayvon drained their entire life savings to fund a fake cryptocurrency firm. And now the bank is taking their home." The silence in the fellowship hall became deafening. Pastor Williams looked down at the document, unfolding it slowly. His eyes widened as he read the official bank letterhead and the massive default numbers printed clearly on the page. The sorority sisters gasped out loud, their eyes darting from the paper to my mother. Vivian's face drained of all color. Her performative tears dried up instantly, leaving behind a mask of stark gray panic. Her flawless upper-class image shattered right there on the church carpet. She tried to snatch the paper, but the pastor pulled it away, looking at her with profound shock. Trayvon's face turned a violently angry shade of red. The illusion of the wealthy entrepreneur was entirely destroyed. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, pointing a shaking finger inches from my face. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter failure," he hissed, his voice shaking with pure fury. "My company is completely legitimate. I have a massive deal closing this week with a major investor. When that money hits my account, you are going to look like a broke, pathetic fool. Keep your precious charity money, Valerie. I am going to be richer than you could ever imagine." He grabbed Vivian by the arm and shoved his way through the crowd, dragging her toward the parking lot, while the entire church watched them leave in disgrace. I walked out of the church building, feeling a deep sense of cold precision. Tuesday morning arrived with dark storm clouds and steady rain washing over the city. I was sitting in my immaculate corner office on the 40th floor of my firm headquarters. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the skyline. I was reviewing the final acquisition paperwork for Phoenix Holdings when my desk phone buzzed. My receptionist sounded incredibly confused as she informed me that a woman named Chelsea was in the lobby, demanding to see me without an appointment. I smiled a very grim smile and told her to send my sister-in-law right up. A few minutes later, Chelsea aggressively pushed open my heavy glass office door. She was wearing her usual flashy designer labels and clutching a luxury handbag she had undoubtedly bought on credit. But the moment she stepped inside my office, her entire aggressive posture vanished. She stopped dead in the center of the room, her mouth falling slightly open. Her eyes darted around, taking in the expensive modern art, the massive mahogany desk, and the sheer scale of my corporate workspace. She looked through the glass walls at the bustling, multi-million-dollar trading floor outside. This reality completely destroyed the lies Trayvon and Vivian had fed her about me being a broke, bitter woman living in a sad apartment. Chelsea recovered her composure, quickly falling back on her familiar weapons of entitlement and weaponized white fragility. She marched up to my desk and crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "I am only here because Trayvon is too proud to ask for your help. After the vicious stunt you pulled at church," she demanded, her voice dripping with condescension. "We need a bridge loan, Valerie. Just a small bridge loan to cover our operating expenses until the end of the week." I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair, keeping my face completely blank. Without breaking eye contact, I discreetly tapped the screen of my smartphone resting on the desk, activating a hidden audio recording app. "A bridge loan," I repeated softly. "A bridge loan for what exactly?" "Chelsea." She let out a dramatic, heavy sigh, and her eyes instantly welled up with performative tears. "You are just so mean and cold," she sobbed, trying to play the victim card. "You have absolutely no family values. Trayvon is out there working 24 hours a day, trying to build generational wealth for this family, and you just sit up here in your ivory tower judging him. He just needs a tiny loan to keep the business running until his big investor payout clears on Friday. If you cared about this family at all, you would write the check right now and apologize." I stared at her crying display with absolute disgust. No legitimate institutional investor is giving Trayvon a single dime. "Chelsea?" I told her, my tone dropping to a freezing register. "His company is a complete shell. It is a financial black hole. He used your in-laws' house as a personal ATM, and now they are going to be completely homeless. You are living inside a massive delusion." Chelsea's face contorted with pure, unadulterated arrogance. The fake tears vanished as quickly as they had appeared. "That just shows exactly how completely clueless you are about high-level business," she sneered, leaning over my mahogany desk and glaring at me. "Trayvon is a brilliant visionary. Sterling Global Capital is wiring him $500,000 this Friday. So keep your pathetic little job and your selfish money. We do not need you. We are going to be richer than you could ever dream." She spun around on her designer heels and stormed out of the office, slamming the heavy glass door so hard the walls rattled. I sat frozen in my chair, the recording still capturing the silence in the room. The name she had just screamed at me echoed loudly in my mind. Sterling Global Capital. My firm risk management and compliance department had just flagged that exact corporate entity less than a month ago. I did not even need to run a background search on the database. I already knew exactly who they were. Sterling Global Capital was not a venture capital firm. It was a notorious offshore shell corporation currently under active federal investigation for operating a massive Ponzi scheme. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Trayvon was not a brilliant investor securing venture capital. He was acting as a money mule. He was laundering dirty illicit funds for a criminal syndicate, and he was about to receive $500,000 of stolen money directly into his personal bank accounts. Trayvon was not investing. He was stealing on a federal level. My brother was about to bring the entire weight of the United States government crashing down on his own head. The door of my apartment closed with a quiet click, securing the heavy deadbolt against my father and his desperate tears. I walked back into my living room feeling absolutely nothing but cold clarity. Desmond had made his choice. He chose to protect the criminal who was actively stealing from him rather than hold his golden son accountable. He chose the illusion of family loyalty over the reality of fraud. The fast track for the foreclosure was officially greenlit. The legal machinery was in motion, and there was nothing left to negotiate. The county auction was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I was going to ensure that Phoenix Holdings took absolute legal possession of the property. 5 days before the house was set to be sold on the courthouse steps, I was sitting in my office when Aunt Loretta sent me a link to Chelsea's social media page. You would think a family facing imminent eviction would be packing their belongings into cardboard boxes. You would think they would be securing a cheap rental apartment or calling moving companies. Instead, the video playing on my computer screen showed that Trayvon and Chelsea were throwing a massive, lavish backyard barbecue at my parents' house. The footage was surreal. Trayvon had hired a professional catering company. There were massive aluminum trays of smoked brisket, expensive grilled seafood, and overflowing coolers of imported beer set up on the patio. Chelsea was holding a glass of champagne, wearing a brand new designer sundress, and laughing loudly for the camera. Trayvon was standing by the edge of the swimming pool holding court with his fraternity brothers and the remaining associates from his fake crypto company. He was smoking a thick, expensive cigar and acting like he was the undisputed king of the world. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They were literally throwing a party to celebrate their own foreclosure. According to Loretta, Trayvon had spun a magnificent web of lies to keep his parents completely docile and compliant. He knew Desmond was panicking after I refused to pay the massive debt. So Trayvon simply manufactured a miracle out of thin air. He sat Desmond and Vivian down in the living room and told them that the terrifying foreclosure notices they had received were actually just a complicated legal formality. He claimed he had used his high-level business connections to find an anonymous, wealthy angel investor. He told my parents this mysterious corporate entity was called Phoenix Holdings. Trayvon confidently assured them that he had personally spoken to the top executives at Phoenix Holdings and brokered a brilliant backroom deal. He told Vivian that this angel investor was going to purchase the house at the county auction specifically to clear the bad debt. Once the deed was transferred, he promised that Phoenix Holdings was going to allow the family to continue living in the luxury home completely rent-free as a personal favor to him because of his future business potential. He convinced my parents that the foreclosure was actually a strategic financial maneuver designed to save their wealth. And of course, Vivian swallowed the lie whole. She believed it because she desperately needed to believe that her golden child was a genius rather than a criminal. She needed to believe that Trayvon was their ultimate savior. She paraded around the barbecue telling all of her friends and church members that her son was a brilliant businessman who had just outsmarted the bank. She was so deeply entrenched in her own delusion that she actually felt victorious. That evening, my personal phone lit up with a new voicemail notification. I was sitting in my private wealth attorney office going over the final auction strategy. Robert was sitting across the wide mahogany desk reviewing the proxy bidding forms that would allow us to operate behind a veil of corporate secrecy. I pressed play on the voicemail and put it on speakerphone so the audio filled the quiet room. It was my mother. Her voice was not panicked or sad or regretful. It was dripping with absolute smug arrogance. I could hear the loud music and the clinking of glasses from the barbecue in the background. She had clearly been drinking wine and her words were slightly slurred, but the malice was crystal clear. Valerie. She began letting out a short, condescending laugh. I am just calling to let you know that you failed. You tried to destroy your brother out of pure, bitter jealousy, but you failed. Trayvon just saved our family. He found an amazing angel investor who is buying the house for us. We are going to stay right here in our beautiful home, and we do not owe the bank a single dime. You thought you could hold your little charity money over our heads and force us to bow down to you. You thought you could dictate terms to your father and disrespect this family. Well, look at what happened. Your brother stepped up like a real man. He used his brilliance to protect his parents. We never needed your bitter money, Valerie. We never needed you. So do not bother calling us back. The voicemail ended with a sharp electronic click. Robert looked up from his stack of legal documents, his eyebrows raised in pure disbelief. He had been practicing high-level corporate law for 3 decades, and even he was completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of their delusion. He asked me if they seriously believed an anonymous investment firm was just going to buy a luxury property at a county auction and hand it over to strangers for free. I told him that my family lived in a reality constructed entirely out of ego and denial. They believed it because Trayvon said it, and Trayvon said it because he was a coward trying to buy himself a few more days of fake respect before the federal agents inevitably arrived. I picked up my expensive silver pen and pulled the thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood desk. The paperwork was the final authorization for Phoenix Holdings to act as the primary bidder at the county foreclosure auction. We had the capital ready to outbid any casual real estate flippers or local property investors. I was going to take absolute legal possession of the property and transfer the deed directly into my anonymous, limited liability company. I slowly signed my name on the bottom of the proxy forms, feeling a profound sense of quiet satisfaction. My mother was currently standing in a backyard she no longer owned, celebrating her golden child and bragging about the very corporate entity I had created to finalize her ruin. She was loudly thanking Phoenix Holdings for saving her family, completely unaware that Phoenix Holdings was simply the weapon I was using to finally hold them accountable. I slid the perfectly signed documents back across the desk to Robert and told him to secure the winning bid on Thursday morning. The grand illusion of their miraculous rescue was about to crash into the brutal reality of a formal eviction notice. Thursday morning arrived with a biting chill that perfectly matched the atmosphere in my office. I sat behind my mahogany desk with my phone on speaker. Robert was already standing on the concrete steps of the county courthouse. He had a Bluetooth earpiece in and was giving me a steady running commentary of the crowd gathering for the foreclosure auction. The courthouse steps were swarming with local real estate investors, bargain hunters, and aggressive property flippers holding clipboards. My parents' house was the crown jewel of the morning docket. A pristine colonial property in a highly desirable suburban neighborhood being sold for absolute pennies on the dollar because of a defaulted secondary mortgage. Robert told me he was standing near the back of the crowd holding the cashier checks from Phoenix Holdings. Then he mentioned something that made me smile, a sharp, humorless smile. Trayvon was there. Robert described a man, matching my brother's exact description, hovering nervously near a marble column across the plaza. Trayvon was wearing dark sunglasses and a pulled-up jacket collar, trying to look inconspicuous while keeping a desperate eye on the proceedings. He was there to watch his massive lie supposedly come true. He genuinely believed that the magical angel investor he invented was going to sweep in and save his parents' house. The county auctioneer stepped up to the podium and began reading the legal description of the property. My childhood home was reduced to a parcel number and a list of outstanding debts. The auctioneer opened the floor for bidding. Robert stayed completely silent, letting the local bottom feeders fight over the initial numbers. A man in a rumpled polo shirt and a backwards baseball cap started the bidding aggressively. He was a known local flipper who bought distressed properties cheap, slapped some gray paint on the walls, and sold them for a massive profit. The price ticked upward steadily as a few other investors threw their numbers into the ring. Trevon was watching the polo shirt guy sweating profusely, probably praying that this was his anonymous savior. The bidding stalled as the price reached a threshold that scared off the casual investors. The flipper in the polo shirt smirked, looking around the plaza like he had already won. He started making notes on his clipboard. The auctioneer called, going once, going twice. I leaned closer to my desk phone and gave Robert the green light. "Crush him," I said, my voice completely flat. Robert raised his hand and dropped a massive all-cash bid on behalf of Phoenix Holdings. He went $30,000 over the current asking price in a single breath. The sheer aggression of the financial flex sent a shockwave through the small crowd on the steps. The flipper in the polo shirt whipped his head around, glaring at Robert. He tried to counter the bid, but Robert immediately countered back with another $10,000 jump without even blinking. It was a display of absolute corporate dominance. The local flipper threw his hands up in disgust and walked away from the steps. The auctioneer called the final numbers. Sold to Phoenix Holdings. I sat back in my leather chair listening to the dull thud of the auctioneer gavel through the phone speaker. I had just legally purchased my parents' house for a fraction of its market value. I owned the roof over their heads, the grass they mowed, and the driveway where Chelsea parked her illicit luxury car. Robert walked up to the clerk table to finalize the deed transfer and sign the closing documents under the veil of the anonymous Delaware Limited Liability Company. Through the phone, Robert told me he was watching Trayvon's reaction. My brother had practically collapsed against the marble column in pure relief. He was furiously typing on his cell phone. A moment later, an automated notification popped up on my secondary monitor. It was a ping from a public real estate tracking site. The title transfer had hit the county registry. Trayvon had clearly set up an alert for the property parcel number. He saw the name Phoenix Holdings printed on the digital public record. He saw the exact corporate entity he had lied about actually winning the auction. Trayvon was celebrating on the courthouse plaza. He thought his elaborate delusion had miraculously become reality. He thought he had successfully outsmarted the bank, outsmarted his parents, and outsmarted the system. He had absolutely no idea that he was celebrating the exact moment his sister became his executioner. The sheer audacity of my brother's criminal mind truly knew no bounds. That same Thursday evening, Aunt Loretta called me from her car parked down the street from my parents' house. She had gone over under the guise of dropping off some church bulletins, but she was actually acting as my eyes and ears. Loretta told me that Trevon had burst through the front door, holding a bottle of champagne and waving a stack of freshly printed papers. He had gathered Desmond and Vivian in the living room for a grand celebration. Loretta had quietly slipped out, but not before seeing exactly what Trayvon was holding. He had manufactured a fake lease agreement. He had gone onto the internet, downloaded a generic commercial residential lease template, and slapped the name Phoenix Holdings across the top. He stood in the living room and told my parents that the angel investor had officially purchased the home at the auction that morning. He told them his brilliant networking had secured their future. They were safe. The house was theirs to live in rent-free. Vivian wept tears of joy and praised God for giving her such a visionary son. Desmond patted him on the back, finally feeling like his decision to forge the mortgage documents had been completely justified by this miraculous outcome. But Trayvon was a parasite, and a parasite never stops feeding until the host is completely dead. He looked at his parents with a completely straight face and told them there was one minor administrative hurdle left to clear. He said that Phoenix Holdings required a standard $10,000 corporate brokerage fee to finalize the rent-free agreement and transfer the property management rights. He claimed it was just legal red tape to satisfy the corporate lawyers. He told them if they paid the fee tonight, the house was theirs forever. My parents were completely destitute. The bank accounts were drained and their credit was destroyed. But they had one single account left. It was a secret emergency savings account they had opened 30 years ago at a small local credit union specifically meant to cover funeral expenses. It held exactly $11,000. Desmond did not even hesitate. He logged into the credit union portal on his laptop and wired $10,000 directly into Trayvon's personal checking account. They emptied their literal burial fund to hand their golden son his final reward. I knew about the transfer immediately. I still had the digital login credentials to that credit union account from years ago when I used to manage their taxes and fix their financial mistakes. I watched the $10,000 leave my parents' account and drop into Trayvon's ledger. I sat at my desk and tracked the money flow in real time. Trayvon did not use the money to pay any investors or legal fees. Less than 20 minutes after the wire cleared my screen, showed two massive pending charges on his debit card. He had just purchased two first-class one-way airline tickets to Dubai for himself and Chelsea. He was running. He knew the federal government was closing in on the Sterling Global Capital Ponzi scheme. He knew the FBI raid was imminent. He had used his parents' absolute last dime of emergency money to fund his international escape, leaving them to face the federal agents and the foreclosure entirely alone. He was going to abandon them to the wolves while drinking champagne at 30,000 feet. I stared at the airline confirmation charges on my screen, feeling a deep, chilling calm settle into my bones. Trayvon thought he was escaping. He thought he had won the game, but he forgot that I was playing on an entirely different board. I opened a highly encrypted secure file on my computer desktop. I began compiling the ultimate destruction package. I dragged the audio file of Chelsea screaming in my office, directly naming Sterling Global Capital into the folder. I added the banking screenshots showing the exact route of the fraudulent home equity loan moving into Apex Digital Ventures. I added the records of Trayvon intercepting the money. Then I attached the digital paper trail of the $10,000 wire transfer from my parents' burial fund, paying for the first-class tickets to Dubai. I even included a digital copy of the fake Phoenix Holdings lease agreement, which Loretta had managed to snap a blurry photo of before leaving the house. I packaged every single piece of damning irrefutable evidence of federal wire fraud, money laundering, and flight risk into one single encrypted email. I addressed the email directly to Agent Harris at the FBI White Collar Crime Division. In the subject line, I typed Apex Digital Ventures Flight Risk Dubai. I did not hesitate for a single second. I hit send and watched the progress bar shoot across the screen until the delivery was confirmed. Trayvon's flight was scheduled to depart on Friday evening. He was currently packing his designer luggage, completely unaware that the federal government now had a mapped-out blueprint of his entire criminal enterprise and his exact flight itinerary. The trap was set, the doors were locked, and the countdown to his absolute ruin had officially begun. The realization that my brother was acting as a money mule for an international criminal syndicate left me sitting in absolute stunned silence. My corporate office felt completely separated from the brutal reality of the situation. Trayvon was not just playing a foolish game with stolen home equity anymore. He was actively participating in a federal crime that carried decades in prison. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering every piece of digital evidence I could find regarding the offshore shell corporation and transferring it to a secure encrypted drive. I did not intend to protect him. I was simply arming myself for the inevitable fallout that was about to hit my family like a catastrophic hurricane. They had spent years treating me like a failure while lifting Trayvon onto an impossible pedestal. Now that pedestal was crumbling into dust and dragging them down with it. I left the firm late that evening and drove back to my luxury apartment downtown. The rain had finally stopped, but the city streets were still slick and reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was a hot shower and a glass of expensive wine. I took the private elevator up to my floor and walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway. As I approached my front door, I saw a figure sitting on the floor, leaning heavily against the wall. It was Desmond. My father looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of a single week. His posture was completely defeated, and his clothes looked rumpled and damp from the earlier rain. He looked nothing like the proud, domineering patriarch who used to lecture me about my lack of ambition at family dinners. He scrambled to his feet the moment he saw me approaching. He did not have his usual arrogant swagger or his booming authoritative voice. Instead, his eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. The bank sent the final paperwork. "Valerie," he said, his voice cracking with pure panic. "The foreclosure is officially initiated. They are not accepting any more delays or partial payments. The grace period is entirely gone. The house is going to the county auction block next week. We are going to lose everything, Valerie. Our home, our reputation, our entire legacy is gone." I unlocked my door and stepped inside without inviting him in. I stood in the entryway, looking at the man who had spent my entire life treating me like a burden. Now he was standing on my welcome mat, shaking with fear because his golden child had ruined his life. Desmond suddenly dropped to his knees right there in the hallway. My father, a man who was obsessed with pride and social standing, was literally kneeling on the floor in front of me. He clasped his hands together and began to openly weep. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he begged me to save them. "Please, Valerie," he sobbed loudly, his dignity completely stripped away. "You are the only one who can fix this. You have the money. Your firm pays you millions. You can write a check right now and make the bank go away. We will pay you back every single penny, I swear to God. Just do not let them take our home." Vivian cannot survive the humiliation of being evicted in front of the entire church. Her friends will destroy her. Please save your family. You are our only hope. I looked down at my father kneeling on the carpet. I felt a strange, profound sense of detachment. I was not angry, and I was not sad. I was just profoundly tired of the constant manipulation and the endless protection they offered Trayvon. They expected me to rescue them from the very person they always claimed was better than me. I told him to stand up. I told him to look me in the eyes. He slowly climbed back to his feet, wiping his tears with the back of his trembling hand. "Dad, I can pay off the entire debt tomorrow morning," I told him, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I can clear the mortgage and save the house. I have the funds liquid and ready to transfer." Desmond's face instantly lit up with a desperate, fragile hope. But there is exactly one condition, I continued, letting the words hang heavily in the air. "You have to go to the police station tomorrow and file a formal report against Trayvon for forging your signature and committing felony mortgage fraud. You have to hand him over to the authorities for what he did. If you file the police report, I will write the check and save the house." The fragile hope on Desmond's face shattered instantly. His expression contorted into pure, absolute horror as he processed my demand. His eyes widened, and he took a physical step back away from me, as if I had just threatened to kill him. "You cannot be serious, Valerie," he whispered, shaking his head violently. "You want me to send your brother to prison. You want me to hand my own son over to the police. You want to ruin his entire life just to prove a point." "He is a criminal, Dad," I replied coldly. My patience completely evaporated. "He stole $250,000 from you and Vivian. He is currently laundering money for a federal Ponzi scheme and lying to your face about venture capital. He is destroying your life, and you are blindly protecting him." "I cannot do it!" Valerie, Desmond pleaded, his voice rising in panic. "I cannot send a black man into the criminal justice system. The system destroys our men. It will chew him up and spit him out. He made a terrible mistake, but he is still my son. He is the man who carries our family name. I will not be the reason my son sits in a federal prison cell. You cannot ask me to choose between our home and your brother's freedom. It is completely unnatural." I looked at him, realizing exactly what this meant. Even now, standing on the absolute brink of total ruin, facing public humiliation and homelessness, Desmond was still choosing Trayvon. He would rather lose everything he owned than hold his precious son accountable for his crimes. He would rather sacrifice his own future and his wife's sanity than admit that Trayvon was a toxic parasite. He was willing to let the bank take the house, but he was not willing to let the law take his golden boy. His pride in Trayvon was a sickness that could not be cured. "I am not asking you to choose anything, Dad," I said softly, the finality echoing in the small space. "You already made your choice a long time ago. You chose him over me my entire life, and now you are choosing him over yourself. You can go home and pack your boxes because I am not giving you a single dime to cover his crimes. You wanted to protect him, so now you get to face the consequences together." I stepped back and pushed the heavy wooden door forward. Desmond reached out a hand to stop it crying out my name and begging me to reconsider. He told me I was being cruel and heartless. I ignored his pathetic cries and shut the door firmly in his face. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a satisfying sound of absolute finality. I stood in my quiet foyer listening to his muffled sobs through the thick wood until he finally gave up and walked heavily away toward the elevator. I walked over to my kitchen island and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a pale glow across the marble counter. I pulled up the contact information for my private wealth attorney and the legal team managing my anonymous real estate acquisitions. Desmond had refused to hold Trayvon accountable, so I was going to take the entire situation out of his hands entirely. I drafted a priority email to my legal team instructing them to aggressively fast-track the foreclosure auction on my parents' property. I gave them the absolute green light to crush any delays, ignore any extensions, and move the asset directly to the county auction block. I authorized the transfer of liquid capital into the holding account. My firm had the resources to sweep the property out from under any casual bidders. I wanted the paperwork flawless and the acquisition completely untraceable until the exact moment I chose to reveal myself. I was going to buy my childhood home out from under them, and I was going to be the one holding the eviction notice. The days of being the quiet, obedient scapegoat were officially over. I pressed send on the email, closed my laptop, and poured myself that glass of wine. The storm outside was raging, but inside my apartment everything was perfectly calm and exactly under my control. It was Friday evening, and the sun was just beginning to set over the Atlanta skyline. Trayvon and Chelsea had decided to celebrate their upcoming flight to Dubai with an extravagant dinner at the most exclusive steakhouse in the city. The restaurant was famous for its velvet booths, crystal chandeliers, and a guest list that included local politicians and wealthy executives. Trayvon wanted to feel like he belonged in that room one last time before fleeing the country. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that he bought with stolen money. Chelsea was draped in an expensive silk dress and wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than my parents' car. They were sitting at a prime corner table right in the middle of the dining room where everyone could see them. They had ordered 2 bottles of vintage champagne and a massive seafood tower. Trayvon was leaning back in his velvet chair, holding his crystal glass and laughing loudly at a joke Chelsea had just made. They were completely intoxicated by their own arrogance. They thought they had executed the perfect escape. They thought my parents' burial fund had bought them a one-way ticket to absolute freedom and limitless wealth in the Middle East. They were probably making plans for the luxury villa they were going to rent in Dubai, completely oblivious to the massive federal trap that was rapidly closing around them. I was not at the restaurant, but Agent Harris gave me a play-by-play of the entire operation later that night. He said the atmosphere in the dining room shifted the exact second the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse swung open. A team of 12 federal agents walked into the elegant lobby. They were wearing dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers with the bright yellow FBI letters printed across the back. The maitre d' rushed forward trying to stop them and protect the privacy of his elite guests. Agent Harris simply flashed his federal badge and kept walking straight into the main dining area. The live jazz music coming from the corner stage abruptly stopped. The low hum of wealthy conversations died out instantly. The entire restaurant went dead silent as the federal agents marched across the expensive plush carpet. Wealthy patrons lowered their forks and stared in absolute shock. Trayvon was just taking a bite of caviar when he finally noticed the agents approaching. Agent Harris said Trayvon's face drained of all color in a matter of seconds. The arrogant, confident smile vanished from his face and was replaced by pure, stark terror. He dropped his silver fork onto the pristine white tablecloth. The clattering sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Agent Harris stopped directly in front of the table, looking down at my brother with absolute authority. "Trayvon Wilson," he announced, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent dining room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and operating an illicit Ponzi scheme." Trayvon tried to stand up, but his legs were trembling so badly he stumbled against the heavy wooden table. He knocked over his crystal champagne flute, sending expensive vintage wine spilling all over Chelsea designer silk dress. He held his hands up in a desperate panic. He started stammering and begging, telling the agents there must be a massive misunderstanding. He claimed he was a legitimate venture capitalist and that he had a flight to catch for an important international business meeting. He told them they were making a huge mistake and ruining his reputation. Agent Harris did not even blink. He stepped forward, grabbed Trayvon by the arms and spun him around roughly. He pushed my brother against the table and pulled his arms behind his back. The loud metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around Trayvon's wrists echoed through the steakhouse. The federal agents began reading him his Miranda rights out loud for every single prominent citizen in Atlanta to hear. The golden boy was completely exposed as a desperate, pathetic fraud. Chelsea's reaction was absolute, pure chaos. She looked down at the spilled champagne on her dress and then looked up at the federal agents swarming her table. The reality of the situation finally pierced through her dense layer of entitlement. She realized the Dubai trip was never going to happen. The luxury lifestyle was entirely fake, and she was sitting right in the middle of a federal crime scene. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She dropped her expensive leather clutch onto the floor and bolted out of her chair. She tried to make a frantic run for the kitchen doors at the back of the restaurant, hoping to slip away in the confusion. She did not make it more than 5 steps. A female federal agent easily intercepted her, grabbing Chelsea firmly by the shoulder and spinning her around. Chelsea started flailing her arms and crying hysterically, telling the agent not to touch her expensive dress. The agent calmly informed her that she was being officially detained for questioning regarding her knowledge of the Sterling global capital fraud and the international flight risk. The entire restaurant watched in absolute silence as Trayvon and Chelsea were paraded through the dining room in total disgrace. The wealthy politicians and business owners whispered to each other, watching the local fraudster get dragged out the front doors in heavy steel chains. The valet brought the dark federal vehicles right up to the curb, and Trayvon was shoved into the back of a black SUV. His grand international escape ended in the back of a government transport vehicle. While this spectacular downfall was happening in the city, Vivian and Desmond were sitting in their colonial house in the suburbs. They were completely oblivious to the federal raid. They were sitting in the living room, probably discussing how brilliant Trayvon was for finding the magical angel investor. They believed their house was safe and their future was secure. They thought they had successfully outsmarted me and avoided the consequences of their toxic actions. The sharp ringing of the house phone shattered the quiet suburban evening. Vivian picked up the receiver, expecting to hear Trayvon calling from the airport to tell them he was boarding his first-class flight. Instead, it was Chelsea calling from a federal detention holding room. Chelsea was sobbing so hysterically she could barely form coherent sentences. She screamed into the phone that Trayvon had been arrested by the FBI at a steakhouse. She wailed about the handcuffs and the fraud charges and the confiscated passports. She told Vivian that all the bank accounts were frozen and the federal government was seizing everything. Vivian dropped the phone receiver onto the hardwood floor. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure despair. The illusion of her perfect family was instantly vaporized. Desmond jumped out of his armchair, his chest tight with sudden panic as Vivian screamed that their golden child was going to federal prison. They started pacing the living room in a state of absolute blind terror, trying to figure out how to bail out a son facing federal charges with literally $0 in their bank accounts. They had given him their very last dime just hours ago. They were completely trapped in their own nightmare. Vivian was hyperventilating and Desmond was clutching his head trying to process the magnitude of the disaster. They thought the evening could not possibly get any worse. They thought they had reached the absolute bottom of their despair. And then a heavy, booming knock echoed from the front door. It was not a polite, neighborly knock. It was the firm, authoritative pounding of law enforcement. Desmond practically dragged his feet across the foyer, his hands shaking violently as he reached for the brass doorknob. He opened the heavy wooden door expecting to see federal agents coming to arrest him for his part in the mortgage fraud. Instead, he found a stern-looking county sheriff standing on the front porch. The sheriff was not wearing an FBI windbreaker. He was wearing his local county uniform and holding a thick, heavy stack of legal documents attached to a solid clipboard. The sheriff looked at Desmond with a completely blank professional expression and handed him the paperwork. It was the formal 30-day notice of eviction from the new legal owner of the property, Phoenix Holdings. Desmond stood frozen in the grand foyer of the colonial house, staring at the county sheriff standing on his front porch. The heavy brass knocker was still echoing in his ears. The sheriff did not look like a man who cared about the manicured lawns or the expensive luxury cars parked in the neighborhood. He looked bored, tired, and completely immune to the wealthy facade my parents had spent decades building. Desmond opened the door wider, his hands trembling as he looked at the thick stack of papers clipped to the sheriff heavy-duty board. "Good evening, sir," the sheriff said, his voice flat and mechanical. "I am looking for Desmond and Vivian Wilson." Desmond swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. "That is me," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. Vivian appeared behind him, drawn by the deep, unfamiliar voice at her front door. She was still clutching the house phone receiver to her chest, still hyperventilating from Chelsea's hysterical phone call about Trevon being dragged out of the steakhouse in federal handcuffs. "What is it, Desmond?" she demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "Who is at the door at this hour?" The sheriff stepped slightly into the light of the porch fixture. He did not introduce himself or offer any comforting words. He simply unclipped the top packet of papers and held them out. "I am here to serve an official 48-hour notice to vacate the premises," he stated loudly enough for Vivian to hear. "This property was legally purchased at the county auction yesterday morning by an investment firm called Phoenix Holdings. You are currently trespassing on private property." The words hit Desmond like a physical blow to the chest. He stumbled back a step, practically ripping the papers from the sheriff's hand. His eyes darted over the bold black letters printed across the top of the document. "Formal notice of eviction order to vacate." Vivian pushed past him, her face contorting into a mask of pure outraged denial. "There has been a massive mistake, officer," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at his uniform. "My son Trevon already took care of this. We have an angel investor. We have a legally binding lease agreement with Phoenix Holdings allowing us to stay here. We just paid them $10,000 in brokerage fees this very afternoon." Desmond frantically rushed over to the side table in the hallway and grabbed the generic printed lease Trevon had given them. He shoved it toward the sheriff, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. "Look right here," Desmond pleaded desperately. "It is signed and executed. We have the right to be here." The sheriff did not even take the paper. He just glanced down at it and let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. "Sir, that document is completely worthless," he said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "Phoenix Holdings filed the deed transfer directly with the county clerk at 9 o'clock yesterday morning. They explicitly listed this property as unoccupied and slated for immediate possession. Whatever paper you are holding, it was not issued by the legal owners. If you paid someone $10,000 for that, you were scammed. You need to pack your belongings and leave." The heavy silence that followed his words felt like a physical weight pressing down on the grand foyer. Desmond stared at the worthless piece of paper in his hands. The reality of the betrayal was so immense it defied logic. Trevon had not negotiated a miracle. Trevon had not saved the family. Trevon had carefully and maliciously scammed his own parents out of their absolute last dime of emergency burial money just to fund a luxury flight to Dubai. He had lied right to their faces while drinking their champagne and eating the catering they could not afford. He had left them completely defenseless against a legal eviction just to buy himself a few hours of head start. But Vivian refused to accept reality. She refused to believe her golden son was a criminal, and she absolutely refused to be spoken to like a vagrant by a county employee. She drew herself up to her full height, crossing her arms and glaring at the sheriff. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she shrieked, her voice echoing out into the quiet suburban street. "I am a senior pillar of the First Fellowship megachurch. My husband is a respected financial executive. We host charity galas in this very living room. You cannot just march up to my door and threaten to throw my family out into the street. I will be calling the chief of police and my pastor. You will lose your job for harassing us." The sheriff did not even blink. His face hardened into a mask of absolute authority. "Mom, I do not care if you are the mayor of this city," he replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "The law is the law. This house belongs to Phoenix Holdings. You have exactly 48 hours to remove your personal property and vacate the premises. If you are still inside this structure when I return on Monday morning, I will not be knocking. I will come back with a full squad, and you will be physically removed and arrested for criminal trespassing. Have a good night." He turned around and walked back down the pristine concrete driveway. The red and blue flashing lights of his cruiser cast long, distorted shadows across the expensive landscaping Vivian had spent years bragging about. Desmond slammed the heavy front door shut and locked the deadbolt, as if that could somehow keep the reality of their situation outside. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Everything was gone. Trayvon was sitting in a federal holding cell. The bank accounts were completely drained to zero, and they had exactly 2 days before armed officers threw them out onto the front lawn. The antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway sounded like a countdown to their absolute destruction. The beautiful colonial home they had leveraged to fund their golden boy was no longer their sanctuary. It was a trap, and the walls were rapidly closing in. Vivian was pacing the foyer, pulling at her expensive hair and muttering hysterically to herself. "Call them!" she suddenly screamed, pointing at the eviction notice still clutched in Desmond's hand. "Call Phoenix Holdings right now. Trayvon said he spoke to their executives. Maybe it is just a clerical error. Maybe the holding company does not know the county issued an eviction. Call them and tell them who we are." Desmond scrambled to pull out his burner phone. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped it twice before finally dialing the corporate contact number listed at the bottom of the eviction notice. He put the phone on speaker, holding his breath as it rang. It rang 3 times before connecting. But a living, breathing executive did not answer the phone. Instead, a cold, automated corporate voice filled the silent hallway. "Thank you for calling, Phoenix Holdings," the recording stated in a flat, robotic tone. "Our offices are currently closed. Please leave a message and a representative will review your inquiry." Desmond let out a sound of pure, hopeless desperation. He ended the call and threw the burner phone onto the carpet. Vivian collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The illusion of their wealthy suburban life had finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Desmond slowly picked up the eviction notice again. His eyes scanned the bold black text, looking for any possible loophole, any glimmer of hope to cling to. His gaze landed on the official corporate address printed at the very top of the letterhead. It was a high-rise building located in the absolute most expensive downtown financial district of Atlanta. Desmond's eyes widened slightly as a frantic, desperate plan began to form in his mind. Phone calls were too easy to ignore. An automated system could not see their tears or hear their pathetic begging. They were entirely out of money, out of time, and out of options. Their only son was locked in a federal cage, and their friends at the country club would cut them off the exact second the scandal broke on the local news. They had literally no one left to call. Desmond looked over at Vivian, his face pale and sweating profusely. "Get up, Vivian," he said, his voice cracking with pure, desperate panic. "Get your coat and start packing whatever you can carry. We cannot handle this over a phone call. We have to go downtown first thing on Monday morning. We have to walk directly into the corporate headquarters of Phoenix Holdings and beg the CEO face to face to let us keep our home." While my parents spent their entire weekend drowning in cardboard boxes and rehearsing their pathetic apologies for a CEO they had never met, Chelsea was experiencing her own harsh collision with reality. The federal agents had detained her at the steakhouse and transported her directly to a bleak interrogation room in the downtown field office. She sat there in her ruined silk dress, shivering under the harsh fluorescent lights, while two seasoned financial crime investigators laid out the absolute truth about her golden ticket. They showed her the banking screenshots, the offshore shell companies, and the fraudulent home equity transfers. They played the audio recording of her screaming in my office, confirming her knowledge of Sterling Global Capital. They completely dismantled the illusion of Trayvon being a legitimate venture capitalist. Chelsea realized in a matter of minutes that there was no angel investor, no multi-million-dollar buyout, and absolutely no first-class flight to a luxury villa in Dubai. Her entire glamorous future was nothing but a massive federal crime scene. The agents eventually released her simply because her name was not officially listed as a primary officer on the Apex Digital Ventures Incorporation documents. They gave her a stern warning not to leave the country and escorted her out of the federal building into the cold night air. Chelsea stood on the concrete sidewalk and dropped the Loyal Devoted Fiancé Act instantly. She was a survivor of the most parasitic kind, and she knew exactly when to abandon a sinking ship. She did not shed a single tear for the man she had proudly defended in my office. She did not pace the pavement worrying about the federal charges he was facing. Instead, a dark, chilling calculation settled over her features. She hailed a local taxi and gave the driver the address to the upscale high-rise condo Trayvon rented in Midtown. She walked into the empty condo and immediately went to work. Chelsea was entirely ruthless. She marched straight into the massive walk-in closet and pulled out a matching set of designer luggage. She did not pack memories or sentimental photographs. She packed liquid assets. She stripped the hangers of every single piece of expensive couture Trayvon had bought her with stolen money. She emptied the velvet jewelry boxes, tossing diamond tennis bracelets, gold chains, and emerald earrings into a small leather travel case. She even went through his side of the closet, taking his expensive designer watches and limited edition sneakers, because she knew they could be easily pawned for quick cash. She moved through the condo like a locust, stripping the environment of anything valuable. When the suitcases were completely full, she moved to the kitchen island and opened her laptop. Chelsea had the login credentials to their primary joint checking account. Trayvon used that account for their daily luxury expenses, and it still held around $15,000 of residual stolen funds. Chelsea did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She initiated an immediate wire transfer, moving every single penny out of the joint account and into a private independent account under her maiden name. She watched the balance drop to absolute zero with a completely blank expression. She took the very last dime her beloved black husband had to his name, leaving him with absolutely nothing to buy food from the prison commissary or hire a decent defense attorney. She booked a cheap one-way domestic flight to a state completely outside of the federal jurisdiction investigating Sterling Global Capital. She loaded her heavy designer bags into an awaiting rideshare vehicle. As she sat in the back seat, heading toward the airport, she pulled her cell phone out of her purse. She navigated to her service provider and permanently disconnected her phone number, wiping her digital footprint clean. She deleted her social media profiles and completely erased her connection to the Wilson family. She abandoned Trayvon to the federal justice system without a single backward glance, completely ready to find a new wealthy host to fund her lavish lifestyle. While Chelsea was flying across the country, Vivian and Desmond were trapped in their own personal hell. The weekend passed in an agonizing blur of packing and blind panic. They stuffed 30 years of accumulated possessions into garbage bags and cardboard boxes, terrified that the county sheriff would return at any moment to throw their belongings onto the front lawn. By Monday morning, the house looked like a disaster zone. The grand colonial property they had been so fiercely proud of was stripped bare. The house phone rang sharply, cutting through the tense silence of the empty living room. Vivian scrambled over the boxes to answer it. It was an automated collect call from the county detention center. Trevon was on the line, his voice shaking and sounding incredibly small. The arrogant golden boy had spent the entire weekend locked in a concrete cell surrounded by hardened criminals. He had just attended his preliminary bail hearing, and the judge had deemed him a massive flight risk due to the plane tickets to Dubai I had conveniently forwarded to the FBI. His bail was set at a staggering $500,000. Trayvon was crying, begging Vivian to put up the house as collateral to get him out. Vivian broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She had to confess the devastating truth to her precious son. She told him the house was gone, that it had been sold at absolute auction to Phoenix Holdings, and that they had just received a 48-hour eviction notice. She told him they were completely destitute, and that his magical angel investor had never actually existed. Trayvon went dead silent on the other end of the line, the crushing reality of his total failure finally sinking in. But Vivian could not bear to hear him sound so defeated. She frantically wiped her face and promised him she would fix it. She told Trayvon not to worry because she was going to call Chelsea. She reasoned that Chelsea still had access to his business accounts and could surely hire a high-powered defense attorney or post a cash bond. Trayvon let out a desperate breath of relief, telling his mother to hurry. Vivian hung up the receiver and immediately dialed Chelsea's cell phone number, praying that her loyal future daughter-in-law would swoop in to save the day. Vivian pressed the phone to her ear and listened. She did not hear the phone ring. Instead, a cold, automated voice echoed through the speaker. "The number you have reached has been disconnected and is no longer in service." Vivian pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at it in total disbelief. She dialed the number a second time, and then a third time, but the robotic message remained exactly the same. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Chelsea was gone. The money was gone. The house was gone. Vivian slowly lowered the phone, the dial tone buzzing endlessly in the quiet, empty house. They were completely and entirely out of options. Monday morning arrived with a heavy gray overcast that completely blanketed the downtown financial district. The towering skyscraper that housed the corporate offices of Phoenix Holdings was a massive monolith of sleek black glass and polished steel. It stood right in the center of the city, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable wealth. Desmond and Vivian parked their aging car in the underground parking garage and made their way to the ground floor. They looked absolutely terrible. The weekend of packing and crying over Trayvon's federal arrest had completely stripped away their country club arrogance. Desmond was wearing a suit that looked slightly rumpled and entirely too big for his suddenly diminished frame. Vivian had dark, heavy circles under her eyes, and her usually immaculate hair was pulled back into a messy knot. They did not look like proud suburban socialites anymore. They looked like two desperate, terrified people walking to their own execution. They pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped into the massive corporate lobby. The interior was designed to intimidate. The floors were covered in pristine white marble that echoed with every footstep, and giant abstract sculptures dominated the open spaces. Men and women in sharp, expensive suits walked purposefully past them, carrying briefcases and tablets. My parents stood near the entrance, looking completely out of place and entirely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the corporate power surrounding them. Desmond took a deep breath, attempting to straighten his tie and puff out his chest. He walked up to the intimidating front security desk, trying to summon the authoritative voice he used to use when lecturing me about my lack of ambition. He told the security guard that he needed an emergency meeting with the CEO of Phoenix Holdings regarding a critical residential real estate matter. His voice cracked on the final word, completely betraying his panic. The guard did not look impressed. He typed something into his computer, picked up a sleek desk phone, and murmured a few words into the receiver. A moment later, the guard pointed to a designated waiting area across the lobby and told them to have a seat. He said an executive assistant would be down shortly to evaluate their request. Desmond and Vivian walked over to the expensive white leather couches and sat down stiffly on the very edge of the cushions. I knew exactly what they were doing because I was watching the entire pathetic display in real time through the high-definition security cameras from the top floor. I sat in my spacious office staring at the live video feed on my monitor. I watched my parents huddled together in the lobby, furiously rehearsing their lines. They were treating this like a performance. Desmond was gesturing with his hands, practicing his desperate pitch. He was going to offer the Phantom CEO anything he wanted. He was going to beg for a payment plan or a grace period. Vivian was sitting next to him, clutching her purse and actively practicing her tears. I watched my mother pull a tissue from her bag and dab at her dry eyes, preparing to turn on the waterworks the exact second she walked into the executive suite. They had entirely constructed a heartbreaking sob story to manipulate the situation. They were going to use Trayvon's criminal downfall as a tragedy to gain sympathy. They planned to weep about their golden son being unjustly locked away in a federal detention center, leaving them old and sick and completely destitute. They were going to say that Trayvon was just a naive boy who got taken advantage of by bad business partners. They were going to lean heavily on their status as devoted church pillars, claiming that evicting them would be a cruelty against God and a terrible mark on the company public image. They believed that if they just cried hard enough and begged loud enough, this anonymous corporate entity would take pity on their broken family and let them keep the house. They had absolutely no idea that their tears meant nothing to the person watching them through the camera lens. After 30 long, agonizing minutes of letting them sweat in the lobby, I picked up my phone and gave my assistant the final green light. On the security feed, I watched a woman in a sharp charcoal suit approach my parents. She informed them that the CEO had agreed to a brief 10-minute meeting to discuss the eviction notice. Desmond and Vivian practically scrambled to their feet, thanking the assistant profusely. They followed her across the marble floor toward the secure private elevators reserved exclusively for the executive board. They stepped into the glass elevator, and the doors silently closed behind them. The elevator shot upward, climbing 50 stories into the sky in a matter of seconds. My parents stood perfectly still, watching the sprawling city shrink beneath them through the glass walls. Their ears popped as the pressure changed. The higher they went, the smaller and more insignificant they felt. The ride was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the machinery. They were ascending into the absolute highest tier of corporate power, and their nervous dread was palpable. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors slid open to the penthouse level. The atmosphere on this top floor was entirely different from the bustling lobby. It was dead quiet, with thick plush carpeting that absorbed every footstep. The air smelled faintly of expensive leather and fresh rain. The walls were lined with original modern art and tall frosted glass panels that practically radiated success. The assistant led them down a long, wide corridor toward the very back of the building. Desmond was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Vivian was breathing heavily already, forcing the tears to pool in her eyes for maximum effect. They reached the end of the hallway where two massive, heavy oak doors stood closed. The assistant reached out and pushed the heavy brass handles, opening the doors inward to reveal the primary executive boardroom. It was a massive, breathtaking space. A polished mahogany conference table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by 20 luxurious leather executive chairs. The entire back wall was made of pure glass, offering a dizzying panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The morning light filtered through the glass, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dark wood table. Desmond and Vivian stepped tentatively into the vast room, the thick oak doors clicking shut behind them. They stood near the entrance, clutching each other, completely paralyzed by the intimidating luxury of the space. The sheer silence in the room was deafening. At the far end of the long mahogany table, sitting directly in front of the massive glass windows, was the primary executive chair. The high-back leather chair was turned completely around, facing the glass and looking out over the sprawling city below. The phantom CEO of Phoenix Holdings was sitting right there, waiting in total silence. My parents took a hesitant, trembling step forward, completely unaware that they were about to come face to face with the absolute orchestrator of their total ruin, while Desmond and Vivian were descending into pure, panicked madness in the hallway of their foreclosed home. Chelsea was experiencing a very different kind of reality check. She had been detained by the federal agents at the luxury steakhouse and transported directly to a bleak interrogation room in the downtown field office. She sat there in her ruined designer silk dress, shivering under the harsh fluorescent lights, while two seasoned financial crime investigators laid out the absolute truth about her golden ticket. They showed her the banking screenshots, the offshore shell companies, and the fraudulent home equity transfers. They played the audio recording of her screaming in my office, confirming her knowledge of Sterling Global Capital. They completely dismantled the illusion of Trayvon being a legitimate venture capitalist. Chelsea realized in a matter of minutes that there was no angel investor, no multi-million-dollar buyout, and absolutely no first-class flight to a luxury villa in Dubai. Her entire glamorous future was nothing but a massive federal crime scene. The agents eventually released her simply because her name was not officially listed as a primary officer on the Apex Digital Ventures Incorporation documents. Trayvon, in his absolute arrogance, had kept all the legal paperwork under his own name to ensure he retained total control of the stolen assets. That singular act of greed was the only thing keeping Chelsea from being fitted for an orange jumpsuit. The agents gave her a stern warning not to leave the country and escorted her out of the federal building into the cold night air. Chelsea stood on the concrete sidewalk and dropped the loyal, devoted fiancé act instantly. She was a survivor of the most parasitic kind, and she knew exactly when to abandon a sinking ship. She did not shed a single tear for the man she had proudly defended in my office. She did not pace the pavement, worrying about the severe federal charges he was facing or how he was surviving his first night in a concrete cell. Instead, a dark, chilling calculation settled over her features. She hailed a local taxi and gave the driver the address to the upscale high-rise condo Trayvon rented in Midtown. She walked into the empty condo and immediately went to work. Chelsea was entirely ruthless. She marched straight into the massive walk-in closet and pulled out a matching set of designer luggage. She did not pack memories or sentimental photographs. She packed liquid assets. She stripped the hangers of every single piece of expensive couture Trayvon had bought her with stolen money. She emptied the velvet jewelry boxes, tossing diamond tennis bracelets, heavy gold chains, and emerald earrings into a small leather travel case. She even went through his side of the closet, taking his expensive designer watches and limited edition sneakers because she knew they could be easily pawned for quick, untraceable cash. She moved through the condo like a locust, stripping the environment of absolutely anything valuable. When the suitcases were completely full, she moved to the kitchen island and opened her laptop. Chelsea had the login credentials to their primary joint checking account. Trayvon used that account for their daily luxury expenses, and it still held around $25,000 of residual stolen funds. Chelsea did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She initiated an immediate wire transfer, moving every single penny out of the joint account and into a private, independent account under her maiden name. She watched the balance drop to absolute zero with a completely blank expression. She took the very last dime her beloved black husband had to his name, leaving him with absolutely nothing to buy food from the prison commissary or hire a decent defense attorney. She booked a cheap one-way domestic flight to a state completely outside of the federal jurisdiction investigating Sterling Global Capital. She loaded her heavy designer bags into an awaiting rideshare vehicle, leaving the keys to the condo sitting on the kitchen counter. As she sat in the back seat heading toward the airport, she pulled her cell phone out of her purse. She navigated to her service provider and permanently disconnected her phone number, wiping her digital footprint clean. She deleted her social media profiles and completely erased her connection to the Wilson family. She abandoned Trayvon to the federal justice system without a single backward glance, completely ready to find a new wealthy host to fund her lavish lifestyle. While Chelsea was flying across the country, Vivian and Desmond were trapped in their own personal hell. The weekend passed in an agonizing blur of packing and blind panic. They stuffed 30 years of accumulated possessions into garbage bags and cardboard boxes, terrified that the county sheriff would return at any moment to throw their belongings onto the front lawn. By Monday morning, the grand colonial house looked like a complete disaster zone. The beautiful property they had been so fiercely proud of was stripped bare, leaving only echoing walls and empty rooms. Desmond was pacing the living room floor, trying to figure out exactly what he was going to say to the CEO of Phoenix Holdings, when the house phone suddenly rang sharply. The loud ringing cut through the tense silence of the empty living room, making them both jump. Vivian scrambled over a pile of taped cardboard boxes to answer it. Her hands were shaking as she lifted the receiver to her ear. It was an automated collect call from the county detention center. Trayvon was on the line, his voice shaking and sounding incredibly small. The arrogant golden boy had spent the entire weekend locked in a cold concrete cell, surrounded by hardened criminals. He had just attended his preliminary bail hearing, and the judge had deemed him a massive flight risk due to the plane tickets to Dubai I had conveniently forwarded to the FBI. His bail was set at a staggering $500,000. Trayvon was crying, begging Vivian to put up the house as collateral to get him out. Vivian broke down sobbing uncontrollably right there in the empty living room. She had to confess the devastating truth to her precious son. She told him the house was gone, that it had been sold at absolute auction to Phoenix Holdings, and that they had just received a 48-hour eviction notice. She told him they were completely destitute, and that his magical angel investor had never actually existed. Trayvon went dead silent on the other end of the line, the crushing reality of his total failure finally sinking in. He was trapped in a federal cage, and his parents had absolutely nothing left to give him. But Vivian could not bear to hear him sound so defeated. Her absolute refusal to accept reality kicked into overdrive. She frantically wiped her face and promised him she would fix it. She told Trayvon not to worry because she was going to call Chelsea. She reasoned that Chelsea still had access to his business accounts and could surely hire a high-powered defense attorney or post a cash bond to secure his release. "Chelsea loves you, baby," Vivian sobbed into the phone. "She is a good girl, and she will know what to do. I will call her right now, and we will get you out of there before dinner." Trayvon let out a desperate breath of relief, telling his mother to hurry before the guards forced him back to his cell. Vivian hung up the receiver and immediately grabbed her cell phone. Her fingers were trembling as she scrolled through her contacts and dialed Chelsea's number, praying that her loyal future daughter-in-law would swoop in to save the day. She pressed the phone to her ear and listened, waiting for the familiar ringtone. But she did not hear the phone ring. Instead, a cold, automated voice echoed through the speaker. "The number you have reached has been disconnected and is no longer in service." Vivian pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the dark screen in total disbelief. She dialed the number a second time, making sure she had not made a mistake, and then a third time, but the robotic message remained exactly the same. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Chelsea was gone. The money was gone. The house was gone. Vivian slowly lowered the phone, the dial tone buzzing endlessly in the quiet, empty house. They were completely and entirely out of options. The heavy silence in the boardroom stretched on for a suffocating moment before the high back leather chair finally began to move. It turned slowly, deliberately pivoting away from the floor to ceiling windows and the sprawling city skyline. Desmond and Vivian held their breath, their desperate apologies and rehearsed sob stories dying in their throats as the chair locked into place. I sat there perfectly centered at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a sharp tailored charcoal suit and calmly sipping from a porcelain coffee cup. I did not smile. I did not greet them. I simply lowered the cup to its saucer, letting the porcelain click echo loudly in the cavernous room. The absolute shock that ripped through my parents was visceral. Vivian literally physically stumbled backward, her expensive handbag slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. She clutched Desmond's arm, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. Desmond's face drained of all color, his jaw hanging slack, as he stared at me in total speechless horror. The anonymous corporate phantom they had come to beg for mercy was the very daughter they had thrown away like garbage. I reached into the sleek leather portfolio resting on the table and pulled out a thick, stapled document. I pushed it gently, causing it to slide smoothly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of them. "Welcome to Phoenix Holdings," I said, my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "That is the official county deed to the property. I believe you are currently living in my house." For a moment, the only sound in the room was their ragged breathing. They were staring at the deed and then up at me, their minds completely unable to process the total role reversal. Then, like a switch being flipped, Vivian Delusion kicked into overdrive. Her shock violently contorted into a mask of desperate manic relief. "Oh, praise God!" she shrieked, taking a stumbling step toward the table, her hands clasped together in fervent prayer. "Valerie, my sweet girl, you bought the house to save us. I told your father I just knew my daughter loved her family. I knew you would not let us be thrown out into the street. You used your success to rescue us from that terrible mistake Trevon made. Oh, the Lord works in mysterious ways." I let out a sharp, cold laugh that instantly froze the frantic joy right off her face. The laugh was entirely hollow, completely empty of any daughterly affection. "I did not buy that house to save you, Vivian," I stated, leaning forward slightly and lacing my fingers together. "I bought it strictly as a cash-flowing asset for my real estate portfolio. You are not my family. You are simply the current unauthorized occupants of a property slated for immediate redevelopment." Vivian recoiled as if I had slapped her across the face, but I did not give her a single second to recover. I opened the portfolio again and began pulling out perfectly organized stacks of paper, laying them out across the mahogany table like a prosecuting attorney presenting a murder case. I laid out the bank statements proving my initial seed money. I laid out the corporate incorporation documents for Phoenix Holdings, and then I laid down the exact financial record of my stolen college tuition money. "Do you remember this?" I asked, pointing to the decade-old bank transfer. "This was the moment you drained my entire future to fund a failed business venture for your golden boy. You told me I was a burden. You told me I lacked ambition. You told me I was not smart enough to make it in the real world, and that Trayvon was the only one capable of building wealth." I slid another piece of paper across the table. It was the audio transcript of our Thanksgiving dinner. "You stood in my office on Thanksgiving Day and proudly insulted my modest success while bragging about a fake venture capital firm." I continued, my voice echoing in the large room. "You called me a disappointment. You told me my lifestyle was an embarrassment to the family name. And now here you are standing in my corporate headquarters begging me not to throw you out onto the street." Desmond finally found his voice, though it was a pathetic, rasping sound. "Valerie, please," he begged, leaning heavily against the table, his pride completely shattered. "We made mistakes. We were blind. But Trayvon is in a federal holding cell right now. Chelsea took whatever money was left and vanished. We have absolutely nothing. We are completely ruined." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life telling me I was second best. "Yes, you are," I agreed completely, unmoved by his cracking voice. "And it was not a mistake. It was a deliberate choice. You chose to leverage your entire existence on a son who saw you as nothing but walking ATMs." I tapped the worthless generic lease Trevon had drawn up for them, which I had obtained from the county clerk records. "Your brilliant golden child scammed you out of your last $10,000 to fund his escape to Dubai and left you totally defenseless against a legal eviction. He lied to your faces and destroyed you without a second thought. The daughter you called a disappointment is the only reason you are not already sleeping on a park bench. Vivian began to sob real, ugly tears, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She reached out toward me across the wide table, her fingers trembling violently. "What are you going to do to us, Valerie?" She wept, her voice breaking with genuine terror. "Are you going to send the sheriff back to throw your own parents out into the cold? Are you going to leave us homeless?" I watched her cry, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. The emotional hold they once had over me had been completely and permanently severed. I reached into the very bottom of my portfolio and pulled out one final document. It was not an eviction notice. It was a thick, legally binding contract printed on heavy stock paper. I slid the document across the table until it rested directly over the stolen tuition receipt. "I am a businesswoman," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous absolute register. "And right now, you are trespassing on my investment property. I am offering you a new residential lease agreement. But you need to read the fine print very carefully because the terms are brutal and they are absolutely non-negotiable." I watched their eyes drop to the thick legal document resting on the polished mahogany table. Desmond reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the contract toward him. Vivian leaned in her breath, hitching as she stared at the bold numbers printed on the first page. "The monthly rent is set strictly at the current market rate," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "There will be absolutely no family discounts and no special accommodations for your current financial situation. The amount listed on that page is exactly triple what you were previously paying for your original mortgage before Trevon convinced you to drain your equity. Furthermore, the rent is due in full on the first day of every single month. There is no 5-day grace period. There is no leniency for bank holidays or weekends. If the funds do not clear the Phoenix Holdings corporate account by 5 p.m. on the first day of the month, the eviction process will be initiated at 5:01. Desmond let out a choked gasp, staring at the staggering monthly figure. "Valerie, we cannot possibly afford this," he pleaded, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "You know we are on fixed incomes now. Trevon took every single penny we had in our savings and emergency funds to secure that fake commercial office space. We do not have the liquid cash to make these kinds of payments. We will have to sell our cars and pawn whatever jewelry we have left just to make the first month of rent." Vivian looked up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting into a pathetic mask of begging. "Please, Valerie," she whimpered, clutching her hands together against her chest. "You are a billionaire. You own this entire skyscraper and half the real estate in the city. This amount of money is absolutely nothing to you, but it will completely break us. We are your parents. You cannot squeeze blood from a stone." I did not even blink at her tears. I leaned back in my high-leather executive chair and rested my hands on the armrests, looking at them with complete detachment. "You should have considered your fixed income before you handed your entire life savings over to a fraudulent venture capitalist," I replied coldly. "You made a terrible financial investment, and now you are experiencing the negative returns of your own blinding ignorance. My company is not a charity. We acquire assets to generate revenue. How you come up with the money to secure your housing is entirely your problem. You can get second jobs, or you can start liquidating your remaining assets, but the rent will be paid in full every single month without exception." Vivian let out a muffled sob, covering her face with her hands, as the reality of their new impoverished life settled over her. But the financial ruin was not even the most severe part of the contract. I reached across the wide table and tapped my index finger on the 4th page of the lease agreement. "Turn to Section 4, I commanded. Desmond slowly flipped the pages, his hands shaking so violently the heavy stock paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. He read the bolded paragraph, and his face went completely white. The blood drained from his cheeks, and he looked up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. I watched his eyes widen as he struggled to comprehend the strict legal boundaries I had placed on their lives. Section 4 outlines the strict occupancy and visitation rules for this property, I explained, my voice dropping to a hard, uncompromising tone. Trevon and Chelsea are legally barred from the premises in perpetuity. They are not allowed to live there. They are not allowed to sleep on the couch. They are not allowed to stop by for a quick Sunday dinner. They are not legally permitted to step a single foot onto the grass of the front lawn. If Trayvon is somehow released on bail and comes to that house, he will be immediately arrested for criminal trespassing. And if my property managers discover that you have allowed them onto the premises, your lease will be terminated immediately. The sheer brutality of the clause hit Desmond like a physical blow to the chest. His chest heaved and tears finally spilled over his eyelashes, tracking down his weathered cheeks. He looked at me like I was a monster, a stranger he had never met in his entire life. Valerie, how can you do this to your own flesh and blood? He cried out, his voice echoing off the thick glass walls of the boardroom. Trevon is your brother. He is our son. When he gets out of that federal facility, he will have absolutely nowhere else to go. Chelsea has completely abandoned him and drained his accounts. You are forcing us to turn our backs on our own child when he needs us the most. You are tearing this family apart over money and pride. Please, Valerie, do not make us choose between a roof over our heads and our only son. I sat perfectly still, letting his desperate accusations hang in the cold air of the executive suite. They had spent my entire life prioritizing Trevon, excusing his failures, funding his delusions, and letting him walk all over me. They had happily cast me aside to build his pedestal. Now the dynamic was permanently shifted. I am not tearing this family apart, Desmond, I replied, my voice deadly calm and utterly devoid of pity. No, I am just enforcing boundaries. The exact same boundaries you completely failed to establish when you let your golden boy destroy your financial security. Trayvon made his choices, and now he gets to face the federal consequences of those choices. You will not use my property to harbor a federal criminal. If you violate Section 4 of this lease agreement, the county sheriff will arrive the exact same day to remove all of you from the premises. I glanced down at the sleek silver watch on my wrist, watching the second hand sweep across the dark dial. The brief window I had allotted for this pathetic reunion was rapidly coming to a close. I had a multinational corporation to run, and I was entirely done entertaining their tears. You have exactly 10 minutes to sign that document, I stated, looking back up at their terrified faces. If you refuse to sign, or if you attempt to negotiate a single word of those terms, my assistant will escort you out of the building. And when the clock strikes 5 o'clock this evening, the sheriff will clear your belongings out of my house. The choice is entirely yours. You can sign the contract and figure out how to pay market rent, or you can go pack your bags and move into a motel. The heavy silence returned, pressing down on them with crushing force. Desmond buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he wept for the complete loss of his dignity and the total destruction of his family. Vivian stared at the contract, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. The arrogant, wealthy socialite was completely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified woman who had lost absolutely everything she held dear. She looked at the heavy pen resting beside the document. She knew that picking it up meant accepting her total defeat. It meant acknowledging that the daughter she had called a disappointment was now her absolute master. It meant choosing her own survival over her precious golden son. Trembling uncontrollably and completely stripped of all her pride, Vivian reached out her hand. Her manicured fingers hovered over the table for a long, agonizing second before she finally picked up the pen. Her manicured fingers hovered over the table for a long, agonizing second before she finally picked up the pen. The heavy silence in the massive boardroom was broken only by the sharp scratching of the ballpoint pen against the thick parchment paper. Vivian pressed down so hard I thought the tip might tear right through the legal document. She signed her name on the dotted line, sealing her total, absolute submission. She did not look up and she did not speak. She simply slid the contract and the silver pen across the polished mahogany toward her husband. Desmond did not even hesitate because his spirit was completely broken. He picked up the pen with a violently trembling hand and scrawled his signature next to hers. In that exact moment, the entire dynamic of our lives permanently and irreversibly shifted. The heavy, suffocating power they had held over me since I was a little girl simply evaporated into the cold, conditioned air of the executive suite. Vivian was no longer the untouchable matriarch of the Wilson family. She was no longer the cruel judge who dictated my worth at holiday dinners, or the socialite who paraded her golden son around the country club. She was merely my tenant. She was legally and financially bound to my strict rules, living under a roof that I entirely owned, paying a premium monthly price that directly enriched my real estate portfolio. The grand illusion of the wealthy, successful parents had been completely shattered, leaving only two desperate, terrified people who literally had to ask my permission to exist in their own home. I reached across the wide table and pulled the signed contract toward me. I carefully checked the signatures, ensuring every single initial was in the correct place and that the legal binding was absolute. I closed the leather portfolio with a soft, definitive thud that echoed like a gavel striking a block. "You have a copy of the lease in the folder my assistant gave you," I said, my voice perfectly even and brutally professional. "The first rent payment will be automatically deducted from your account in exactly 48 hours. My property manager will conduct random exterior inspections to ensure Section 4 is not being violated. I expect the property to be maintained to its original standard. My assistant will escort you to the lobby now because we are entirely done here." Desmond and Vivian slowly pushed their heavy leather chairs back and stood up. They looked incredibly small and frail, as if the intimidating, expensive space had physically swallowed them whole. Vivian clutched her handbag tightly to her chest. Her shoulders hunched forward as if she were trying to physically shrink away from my gaze. Desmond kept his eyes fixed firmly on the expensive carpet, completely unable to look his daughter in the face after selling his soul and betraying me so deeply. They turned and walked toward the massive oak doors at the end of the room. They moved like literal ghosts, shuffling across the marble floor with heavy, dragging steps. My assistant opened the heavy doors for them, and they stepped out into the quiet hallway without looking back, even once. The heavy brass handles clicked shut, locking them out of my world and sealing them into the miserable, impoverished reality they had created for themselves. I sat alone in the vast, quiet boardroom for a very long time. I turned my high-back leather chair around to face the massive glass windows once again. The sprawling city of Atlanta stretched out beneath me, glowing beautifully in the bright morning sunlight. I stared down at the tiny cars and the microscopic people moving through the busy downtown streets. For a brief, fleeting moment, I felt a sharp, painful pang of sorrow tighten my chest. It was not regret, and it certainly was not guilt. It was a deep, profound mourning for the parents I never truly had. I grieved for the childhood I was denied, for the unconditional love I was never given, and for the tragic, unavoidable fact that it had to end this way. I wished I could have had a mother who was genuinely proud of my accomplishments. I wished I could have had a father who protected me instead of throwing me to the wolves just to save his favorite son. But that sorrow was incredibly short-lived. It washed over me like a brief summer rain, and then completely evaporated, leaving behind a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute liberation. The invisible heavy chains that had bound me to their toxic expectations for 30 years were completely broken. I no longer needed to seek their impossible approval. I no longer needed to fear their cruel judgment. I had survived their absolute worst betrayal, and I had built an undeniable empire from the ashes they left behind. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly light and pure. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, cool air of the penthouse suite, and felt a genuine, peaceful smile spread across my face. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out my cell phone. There was only one person I wanted to talk to in that triumphant moment. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed Aunt Loretta. She answered on the second ring, her warm, familiar voice instantly bringing a sense of true, authentic family into the sterile corporate space. She greeted me with deep affection and asked how my morning was going. I smiled, looking out over the beautiful city skyline. I told her softly that it was finally done. I told her they had signed the lease and that they knew absolutely everything about Phoenix Holdings. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with mutual understanding. Loretta had been the only one who saw the truth all those years ago. The only one who believed in my potential when my own parents called me a financial burden. She told me, her voice thick with emotion, that she was incredibly proud of me. She said I did exactly what I had to do to protect myself and my future. She reminded me that they never deserved my loyalty, but that I had built a beautiful, extraordinary life regardless of their cruelty. I felt a warm tear slide down my cheek, but it was a tear of pure gratitude. I thanked Aunt Loretta quietly, telling her how much I appreciated her always being my real family. We talked for a few more minutes, making happy plans for her to come visit me at the new corporate headquarters before we ended the call. I put my phone away and stood up from the executive chair, completely ready to get back to work. The painful past was finally and permanently behind me. Fast forward 7 months later, and the blistering heat of mid-August was beating down on the Atlanta pavement. My real estate portfolio had expanded by another 15%, and Phoenix Holdings was absolutely dominating the commercial and residential sectors. The new normal had completely settled into place for everyone involved. Every single month, on the exact first day of the month, the exorbitant market rent payment was wired directly from my parents' dwindling account into my corporate holdings. They were barely scraping by, living like terrified ghosts in the massive colonial house that used to be their kingdom. They were selling off old furniture and pawning Vivian jewelry just to make the payments and avoid immediate eviction. Trevon was still sitting in a federal detention center awaiting his massive fraud trial, and Chelsea had completely vanished off the face of the earth with the remaining stolen funds. Everything was perfectly quiet and meticulously controlled until a sudden, unexpected notification popped up on my secure executive monitor, changing the entire game once again. The notification on my secure executive monitor was an urgent, encrypted email from my corporate legal team. The subject line contained just one single word sentencing. I clicked it open and read the official federal court dispatch with absolute clinical precision. Trevon Wilson, the former golden boy of the family and self-proclaimed venture capital prodigy, had just been officially sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. His expensive defense attorney had tried to plead for extreme leniency, leaning heavily on his clean prior record, but the federal judge was entirely unmoved by his rehearsed tears and dramatic apologies. The heavy wooden gavel had dropped with absolute finality, and Trayvon's glamorous future was permanently, completely erased. I leaned back in my high leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. The final domino had officially fallen. The board was completely cleared. Fast forward exactly 1 year later to a crisp, beautifully clear Thanksgiving evening. The air outside was biting and cold, but inside my brand new penthouse apartment, the atmosphere was radiating with incredible warmth and genuine, authentic love. I had recently acquired the stunning top-floor residence in the most exclusive high-rise in Buckhead, and it was entirely mine. There were no ghosts of my parents' toxic expectations haunting these wide hallways, and absolutely no shadows of my past failures hiding in the corners. The massive formal dining table was covered in pristine white linen and decorated with rich, dramatic autumn floral arrangements. The incredible smell of roasted turkey and fresh rosemary drifted from the gourmet kitchen, where a private professional chef was putting the absolute final touches on our holiday feast. I walked around the long table, pouring expensive dark red wine into heavy crystal glasses. The room was completely filled with the sound of bright, joyous laughter. Aunt Loretta was sitting at the head of the table, looking absolutely radiant in a deep emerald dress. She was holding court, telling a hilarious, vibrant story to my closest friends and most trusted business partners. These were the people who had actually supported me from the very beginning. The people who had celebrated my late-night study sessions and mentored me when I was starting my real estate company from the bare ground up. This was my real family. They were not connected to me by biological obligation, but by mutual respect and absolute unwavering loyalty. There was no underlying tension in the room, no passive-aggressive insults traded over the appetizers, and absolutely no one comparing my success to a phantom golden child. As I listened to the happy sounds echoing through my beautiful home, I could not help but think about exactly where my biological family was spending their Thanksgiving holiday. The stark contrast was almost beautifully poetic. Hundreds of miles away, Trayvon was sitting in a deafeningly loud, crowded federal cafeteria wearing a bright, stiff orange jumpsuit. His perfectly manicured hair was gone shaved, down to a harsh, unforgiving buzz cut, and his arrogant, untouchable swagger had been completely beaten out of him by the harsh reality of the prison system. He was eating a sad tray of flavorless processed turkey substitute, surrounded by hardened, aggressive inmates who did not care at all about his fake real estate portfolio or his smooth-talking country club charm. He was just another anonymous number in the system trapped behind razor wire and thick concrete walls staring at the institutional clock and realizing he had 14 more Thanksgivings left to spend in a cage. And then there was Chelsea, the brilliant calculating survivor who thought she had successfully played the ultimate game. She had managed to temporarily escape the federal indictment by draining Trayvon of his last stolen dime before vanishing into the night. But karma is an incredibly patient and ruthless debt collector. The offshore account where she had stashed the stolen funds had been red flagged by the IRS for massive tax evasion. The federal government had swooped in and frozen every single asset she possessed, leaving her absolutely destitute. Now she was living in a rusted, dilapidated trailer park in rural Ohio. She was currently working a grueling double shift at a greasy local diner, wearing a stained polyester uniform and serving cheap, lukewarm coffee to passing truck drivers. Her designer bags were long gone, pawned months ago to pay for basic heating oil. She was spending her Thanksgiving wiping down sticky laminate tables, completely permanently erased from the high society lifestyle she had sacrificed everything to infiltrate. But the most tragic and poetic justice belonged entirely to Desmond and Vivian. Back in Atlanta, the sprawling grand colonial house that used to be their source of ultimate arrogant pride was dead quiet. They were sitting entirely alone at a tiny, cheap folding table in the kitchen, eating a dry, store-bought rotisserie chicken. The house was freezing because they kept the thermostat turned down as low as absolutely possible to save on utility bills. Their elite country club memberships had been permanently revoked. Their luxury leased cars had been aggressively repossessed, and their snobby social circle had completely shunned them after Trayvon's spectacular federal downfall. They were exhausted, broken, and completely aged. Desmond had taken a humiliating job as a night shift security guard at a local industrial warehouse, and Vivian was working as a part-time cashier at a discount grocery store. They were working themselves to the absolute bone for one single terrifying reason. They were completely paralyzed by the fear of missing my rent payment. They knew that if they were even one single hour late, paying the exorbitant triple market rate I had forced them to sign, the ruthless landlord who owned their house would have the county sheriff dragging their remaining possessions out onto the curb. Back in my penthouse, I smiled warmly as Aunt Loretta raised her crystal glass to propose a toast. She looked directly at me, her eyes shining with absolute, undeniable pride. To Valerie, she said, her voice ringing out clearly over the soft jazz music playing in the background, to building your own incredible empire and finally knowing your true worth. Everyone at the table raised their glasses and cheered loudly. I clinked my glass against Loretta, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of total, absolute victory. I excused myself for a brief moment and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city was a sea of shimmering lights, stretching out endlessly into the dark horizon. I stood there taking in the breathtaking view of the empire I had built entirely from the ground up with my own two hands. As I took a slow, satisfying sip of the rich, dark wine, my cell phone vibrated softly in my tailored suit pocket. I pulled it out and looked down at the glowing screen. A push notification had just arrived from my automated property management software. The bright green text illuminated in the dim light of the window. Rent payment of $4,500 successfully received from Vivian Wilson. The payment was 3 full days early. They were so utterly terrified of crossing me and losing the last roof over their heads that they had completely drained their meager holiday paychecks just to ensure the funds cleared ahead of schedule. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket, a cold, highly satisfied smile curving the corners of my mouth. I turned back to look at my beautiful home, my real chosen family, and the incredible luxurious life I had secured for myself. They spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They told me I lacked ambition. They told me I was destined to be a complete failure. They called me a burden. But the thing about burdens is eventually you have to pay for them, and I always collect with interest. Fade to black. The ultimate lesson here is that blood never grants someone a free pass to disrespect you. Setting firm boundaries with toxic relatives is not cruelty. It is a vital act of self-preservation. When you stop chasing the impossible approval of those who diminish your worth, you reclaim the power to build authentic success. True family is built on mutual respect and genuine support, not blind obligation. Never fear walking away from people who only value you when it serves their selfish interests. Share your own story of protecting your peace in the comments below, and please subscribe for more.